Good afternoon and welcome to DPIIC members, DPIIC agency staff, stakeholders, and participants. It's an honor to call to order the 9th meeting of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. I'm Randy Fiorini and I will be serving as the chair today. Beginning in April 2014, we have convened every 6 months to discuss administration priorities and discuss how to implement best available science and best management practices intended to improve statewide water supply reliability and ecosystem conditions in the Delta. This committee is called out in the Delta Reform Act, described in the Delta Plan, and is specifically highlighted in the Governor's California Water Action Plan. This is one of the few venues that exist to help further the sustainable management of the Delta by creating a public dialogue about important initiatives and, in particular, discussing new opportunities for coordinated state and federal interagency action in the Delta. I look forward to the updates on progress we will receive today and to our discussion. As your chairman, I take very seriously the responsibility to lead this committee and recognize what a unique opportunity these meetings present to better coordinate our collective state and federal agency work to further the coequal goals. This is why the Delta Stewardship Council staff and I put so much effort into meeting with each one of you in advance to help prepare a timely and meaningful agenda. I'm satisfied that today's meeting will provide an important opportunity for meaningful outcome-oriented discussion for the important matters we all have an interest in and a responsibility for. Today's agenda consists of 3 parts. We will begin hearing from many of you about the important guidance that the California Water Action Plan and the Delta Plan have provided for your work in the Delta, and to seek agreement on the best practices and recommendations that should be carried forward to future administrations. Next, we will commit to thinking beyond current restoration requirements and entertain thoughts and ideas about how to achieve more integrated and ecosystem function-based restoration. Dr. Jeff Mount from the Public Policy Institute of California will provide some thoughts to stimulate an interactive discussion. And finally, we will focus on our shared goal of one Delta, one science. Dr. John Calloway, our lead scientist, the Delta Stewardship Council's Delta Science Program, will be joined by 3 distinguished panelists to help us review progress and explore how Delta science governance can better support decision-making. Some of you have been here for each of the previous 8 meetings. Some of you are serving as an alternate, and one of you is our newest committee member, Josephine Axt, Director of Planning for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we want to welcome Josephine. At this time, I would like each one of you to introduce yourself, beginning with my fellow Ag Leadership Program participant. Introduce yourself and proceed around the table.
Good afternoon. I'm Jenny Lester Moffitt, and I'm Undersecretary at the Department of Food and Agriculture.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Barry Thom. I'm the Regional Administrator for NOAA Fisheries for the West Coast.
Good afternoon, everybody. Josephine Axt, Chief of Planning and Policy for the Corps of Engineers Regional Office in San Francisco.
Good afternoon. Tim Ramirez, Central Valley Flood Protection Board Member.
Good afternoon. I'm Gail Louie. I'm Supervisor of the Watershed Sections at EPA. I'm here on behalf of Tomas Torres.
Hi, I'm Dan Castleberry. I'm the Assistant Regional Director for Fish and Aquatic Conservation with the Fish and Wildlife Service, here on behalf of Paul Souza, my Regional Director.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Peer. I'm the Assistant General Counsel at the California Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm here on behalf of the Undersecretary Gordon Burns.
Good afternoon. I'm Skip Thompson, a member of the Board of Supervisors in Solano and Chair of the Delta Protection Commission.
I'm Eileen Sobek. I'm the Executive Director of the State Water Resources Control Board, and I'm here on behalf of Felicia Marquez, the Chair of the board.
I'm Mark Sogi. I'm the Pacific Regional Director for USGS. And I'm John Calloway. I'm the lead scientist for the Delta Science Program.
Good afternoon. I'm Deborah Kustick. I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for the Delta Conservancy, and I'm here on behalf of Campbell Ingram, our Executive Officer, who is in Brazil doing assisting Nicaraguan refugees. So.
I'm Dave Mooney. I'm the Area Manager for the Bureau of Reclamation's Bay Delta Office. I'm here on behalf of David Murillo, our Regional Director.
There it is. Carl Wilcox, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, here on behalf of Chuck Bonham, our Director.
Good afternoon, Christopher Turnell from the California Natural Resources Agency, here on behalf of Secretary Laird. Thank you.
And good afternoon, Cindy Messer. I'm the Chief Deputy Director for the Department of Water Resources, and I'm here for our Director, Carla Namath.
Good afternoon. I'm Austin Ewell. I serve as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Water and Science at the Department of Interior, and I'm here, I guess, on behalf of the Secretary of Interior and myself.
Great. Thank you all for attending. A couple of additional introductions. Two of my colleagues on the Delta Stewardship Council are here. Our Vice Chair, Susan Tatayan, and Council Member Ken Weinberg. Welcome. So since our last time meeting, our DPIIC coordinator, Jessica Law, has been selected to serve as the Delta Stewardship Council's Chief Deputy Executive Officer. I want to congratulate Jessica in her new role and express our appreciation to Jessica for the fine job she did as our coordinator. Where is Jessica? There she is. Hi, Jessica. Thank you. I'm also very pleased to announce that our new DPIIC coordinator, Amanda Bohl, who was appointed a few months ago, has been doing a marvelous job preparing for this meeting. Amanda has been with the Council for over 2 years, overseeing meeting services and special projects, including the support of our DPIIC meetings. Prior to joining the Council, Amanda served as Economic Development Lead at the Delta Conservancy and worked in land conservation for many years. Amanda has hit the ground running, and I'd like to invite her to walk the committee through the contents of today's binder. Amanda, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini, and good afternoon, committee members. So the binder that you have in front of you, that most of you received last week, is full of documents that are very relevant to the committee's discussion and also provide updates on a few items that we just simply don't have time to cover through a panel discussion today. So I'll just walk you through kind of some of the key documents there. So for agenda item 2, California Water Action Plan and Delta Plan, we've included the Delta Plan policies and recommendations, which are also available on the Council's website. We also have survey results from the recent Administrative Performance Measures Survey, which is actually on the table in front of you. And the survey results will be used to update the Administrative Performance Measures dashboard, which everyone can access at any time on the Council's website to see the status of the admin performance measures. The results will also be helping the Council as it performs its 5-year review of the Delta Plan. DPIIC agencies provided feedback on 68 of the 121 administrative performance measures, and priority performance measures include preparation of plans for each Delta community, partnerships between agencies, landowners, and businesses, and the adoption of criteria for prioritizing large-scale Delta ecosystem restoration, among many others. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Moving on to agenda item 3, Future Delta. As many of you know, the DPIIC recently released a series of blogs calling for a more integrated and ecosystem-focused approach to restoration. We've included those blogs in the binder for your reference, and then we also have Dr. Jeffrey Mount here on hand today, who will be discussing the ideas with you here shortly. Also included is a memo regarding the Delta Plan Ecosystem Amendment, which updates everyone on the approach the Council is taking, the role of the Interagency Committee, not to be confused with this Interagency Implementation Committee, but another committee that is also consists of representatives from most of the agencies here today. And also included to accompany that is, well, the memo also updates everyone on the status of the synthesis papers that have been developed in support of the amendment. And we have a 2-page fact sheet that summarizes the synthesis papers rather than including all 3 of them in the binder. If you are interested in reading all of the synthesis papers, however, I encourage you to go to our website and look at those. We also have an update from Sustainable Conservation on simplified permitting. As those of you that were here last time may recall, sustainable conservation presented at the last DPIC meeting, and there was much discussion regarding the need for this type of work. Sustainable conservation has made steady progress and is currently coordinating proposed authorizations in partnership with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the Water Board, all DPIC members, to cover a variety of commonly proposed projects, including multi-benefit projects of statewide significance that emphasize restoration. Agenda item 4, One Delta, One Science. John Callaway will discuss this in greater detail when we get to that agenda item, but the Delta Science Program is in the process of updating the Delta Science Plan, and we've included a one-pager describing the process, as well as a summary of the suggested changes to date. We've also included Dr. Mark LaBelle's recent paper on governance. Dr. LaBelle is one of the panelists during this agenda item as well. And the report is focused on the Bay Area, but the information is very relevant to discussions here in the Delta as well. And then also related to governance and more broadly the science enterprise, we are very happy to present the Science Enterprise Workshop Executive Summary, which is also on the table in front of you. And big thanks to Jessica Law and Mike Chakowski for taking this on and for summarizing the work of that multi-day workshop just over a year ago. So at the November 2016 DPIC meeting, which followed directly on the heels of the Science Enterprise Workshop, the committee endorsed the key recommendations from the report, which were focused on 3 primary areas: leadership and linkage of science to resource management, efficient use of available funds, and science credibility, legitimacy, and value to decision makers. So as you'll note during each of our agenda items today and the panel discussions that we are making progress on these recommendations, but more work remains, and DPIC and its member agencies remain a critical component to pursuing these recommendations, both collectively and individually. Also, please find an update on integrated modeling and structured decision-making. There's a 2-pager in there as well about that. During the 2017 DPIC meetings, there was much discussion on these topics as well, much of it stemming from the Science Enterprise Workshop, and so we're happy to report that both efforts are moving forward with the help of most, if not all, DPIC agencies. And finally, agenda item 5, committee business. I just want to make sure everyone is aware that the Bay Delta Science Conference is coming up in September at the Sacramento Convention Center. The council has released its 2017 annual report, which is included in your packets. And we also have meeting notes from the November 2017 DPIC meeting. And then finally, DPIC number 10, the Big 10 is coming up in November, so please save the date for that. And there are a couple of other items on the desk in front of you regarding science governance, and Dr. Callaway and others during that panel will go over those items when they are up here in just a bit. So finally, just some housekeeping. Restrooms are out both doors, so there they are. And then we also have water behind you all in case you need a drink. So that's it.
Amanda, great job.
Thank you.
Clearly, there is a lot going on. We've accumulated a lot of information to include in your binder that will serve as a resource. We can't possibly cover all of those items, but we have selected 3 items to focus on for today's discussion. Is there any question before we move on to agenda item number 2? All right. As I mentioned earlier, we would like to begin the discussion portion of today's meeting on a positive note. The California Water Action Plan and the Delta Plan have been central guiding documents to each of our agencies' work. We all have views about which initiatives and projects in the Delta have been effective and successful. Building upon today's comments, and our executive fellow, Seth Yund, will be taking notes. We intend to prepare a Delta Issues briefing paper for your endorsement at our upcoming November meeting. A briefing paper endorsed by 17 key state and federal agency leaders will hopefully impress upon the next governor the need to prioritize and support initiatives intended to further the coequal goals through an updated California Water Action Plan, maintaining the momentum that has been initiated by the Brown administration. So, see how well you've done your homework. Question number 1, which recommendations in both plans have guided your work in the Delta? I think Cindy Messer would be the place to start.
Okay, well, honestly, looking back at the California Water Action Plan and the Delta Plan, and having been part of the Delta Plan team when it was being developed, it's kind of hard to narrow down on just a few key elements that have guided our work. Both plans obviously cover a wide breadth of topics, from water supply and storage and ecosystem restoration, data, groundwater, you name it. So given sort of the wide breadth of topics and priorities that DWR has and that we're working on and we're tasked with, so much of those plans obviously have guided our work. And some of the elements I jotted down that just were the ones that came to the top of my head and kind of keep surfacing for me, in particular, are things like adaptive management. I think the Delta Plan has been very instrumental in getting momentum around that topic, and I know there's been a lot of efforts recently. Independent Science Board put out a report couple years now, I guess, ago, but that has really started to weave its way into so much of what we do, and we had adaptive management in a lot of our projects, especially around restoration, but honestly, I think it's taken it to a new height, and we're starting to really look at how we do this and how we do it successfully. Data and data management reporting, I think, are key items in both plans that really have been elevated in the last several years that we've been tasked with doing, but also just very interested in how we kind of take the data we generate, which we generate a lot of, but work with our partner entities to kind of get that to a place where we're managing that together and sharing it. And then, of course, many of the water-related and restoration items. So groundwater, another big one, going back through a lot of the recommendations in the Delta Plan around Bulletin 118 and the groundwater management. It's really kind of actually very cool to see how far we've come since the Delta Plan was published, and I know there'll be a lot of updating, but I think that's the fun part, is we can say progress made, and where do we go from here on things like groundwater management, storage, restoration, and so on. So a lot has happened. I think that's kind of was my take-home message going back through.
That's a great kickoff to this conversation. Anyone else?
Yeah, I can share that. This is something that is very familiar with us. We work a lot with Chris and the Resources Agency and our sister agencies on this. We have funded conservation as a way of life has been a big one for us, in agriculture, and we've funded over 500 on-farm water conservation projects through money that we have received through the California Climate Investments Fund. This ranges anywhere from changing out irrigation systems to more efficient irrigation systems, to also looking at timing and of management of the irrigation as well. We've partnered with Department of Water Resources on conjunctive projects as far as looking at moving away from groundwater pumping and looking at the irrigation systems that can actually supply the water to the irrigation districts. But over 100,000 acres of projects that we have funded have been implementing the projects, and that is just where there's just the tip of the iceberg as far as what we funded versus what farmers have really implemented. Another thing is just really looking at the interconnectivity of on-farm recharge, the opportunities for taking some of that flood water, working with the water boards and others as well on looking at those opportunities for the interconnectedness of floodwaters and ability for on-farm recharge during winter months when land is fallow. So those have been the main two things that we've been working on.
Jenny, thanks. As Secretary Ross was one of the 3 co-authors of the Water Action Plan, it must be very satisfying for the EPA, resources, and ag agencies to look at the progress that has been made directly resulting from the guidance and direction that plan has offered. So good to hear some specifics associated with the progress. Eileen, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if Felicia were here, she'd probably hold up a laminated card that she distilled down to something she could carry in her wallet that includes the governor's Water Action Plan. You must have some thoughts about how it's helped the Water Resources Control Board.
Well, it definitely has, and I think first and foremost is propelling us to bring to a close as quickly as we can our efforts in completing the Bay Delta Water Quality Control Plan. And we are, that has been a multi-year effort. Thanks. And we are marching forward and making progress, and that effort really encompasses so many elements that Cindy and Jenny have touched upon, and actually probably has required the involvement of everybody sitting around this table and most of the people sitting in the audience. But at this point, that is really the focus, the Delta focus of the work of the board. But I think that other elements that have really been beneficial is the focus on reduced reliance on the Delta as a primary water source, and that has really, I think, had tentacles far outside the Delta, and has been exciting because it has allowed us to work on passions of Felicia's, like recycled water and other ways of helping communities be more independent, think about local water sources, think about less traditional water sources to help help with groundwater replenishment and with less reliance on the Delta. And it really speaks to all the interconnectivity issues that we've all been talking about. And we are making incremental progress on improving our water right administration in the Delta watershed, and that is a tough assignment, but I think will be complementary to many of the goals, including some of the conservation goals that we've been working on through the guidance provided by both documents.
That's great. Others? Yes, Barry.
Yeah, I'll just highlight, I think, a couple pieces. One, just under that ecosystem restoration and protection, and some of the issues in both hitting the wide range of really focusing on San Joaquin salmon restoration as one area where we put a lot of emphasis on, and getting Chinook in the San Joaquin and spawning this year, which I think was a great success. And then sort of going up to Sacramento, the focus on fish passage at some of the large dams in the system, and the work we're doing to get winter run above Shasta and reintroduce a population there from an ecosystem perspective. The other piece I just highlight is, working through some of these dry periods, the droughts and other dry years, and just the interagency work of trying to balance that, the water needs, the fish needs, and the storage needs in the system, and working together, I think, is a real success.
Mark?
Yeah, USGS, we don't do the on-the-ground projects that many other people do, but we have found both plans really, really helpful for framing the big picture issues. And so we use those to talk to partners, plan our science, et cetera. So very helpful.
Carl?
So from the department's perspective, the water action plan's been kind of the guiding light for most of the work that the department does, whether it's in the watershed or in the Delta or in areas outside of the Delta, and particularly as we engage with the state board in the water quality control plan update, but also in implementing the department's Prop 1 granting program, both in the watershed as well as in the Delta. Unfortunately, it's primarily been funding science work because of the dearth of restoration-related proposals that come to us. But we hope that will change. It's also been the guiding light for the development of the Delta Conservation Framework by the department in response to the pivot from the Bay Delta Conservation Plan to the Water Fix and Eco Restore, and laying out a potential future beyond Eco Restore as far as how we look at the Delta and how we engage with the communities in the Delta to foster ecosystem restoration. I think one of the things we're still struggling with is really defining what ecosystem restoration means within the context of the Delta Plan, but I think this provides a way to engage with the communities in the Delta and the landowner interests, as well as the regulatory agencies, to lay a path forward. So I think those are just a sample of how we've applied it. Certainly, many of the components in it are issues that the department is keenly interested in and engaged in.
I'll jump in, sorry. Yeah, with the Army Corps of Engineers, so interesting to hear everybody's perspective. I guess I would characterize, Randy, your question with the Corps of Engineers more about how it overlaps and is complementary to some of the things that are already going nationally with the Corps of Engineers. Integrated water resources management is a big deal. Ecosystem restoration is one of our primary mission areas. So I just see a lot of complementariness. Unlike USGS, we are a project-focused agency, and so we the folks in the Corps, most of them have to charge projects when they do their work. We're very different than most other agencies. And in that regard, people are focused on doing those studies and projects, and then there's a little bit of programmatic overview that happens. But I thought it would be worthwhile to share one of our studies that we call the Delta Islands and Levees study, where we're trying to make use of annual maintenance dredging in the Stockton ship channel for beneficial reuse to counter subsidence in the, I wrote it down to get it right, Big Break Regional Shoreline Area. There's 80 acres there, and some of you may know that study. It had to pause in the fall of 2014 for a little bit, but it's resumed, it's active. We're hoping to have the final report go from the regional office I'm in to our headquarters in July, and then it would have its last round of review, what we call state and agency review, public review in the fall, and would be ready for congressional authorization in December. So that's kind of exciting, and that would be the first time in I think over 30 years that the Corps was doing active restoration in the Delta. So I think that's good. And I also wanted to speak to the vegetation on levees issue. We were directed by the Water Resources Development Act of 2014 to look at that issue, and it's a very hot topic. I don't need to tell you all in the Delta, and I think we're literally gotten to the point on some of our projects where we're doing a risk assessment on a tree-by-tree basis. Nobody wants to take the trees out. They obviously provide habitat and value, and we have to balance that with engineering considerations in our project. And I know there's a national team put together that's working on that issue in general, and then with special emphasis on the Delta. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Josephine has identified two of the recommendations in the Delta plan, the levee vegetation and the dredging study that were directed at Army Corps. And so it's been rewarding to see some progress being made on those two recommendations. So thanks for bringing that update.
And I'm sorry, really quick, one alibi. I knew there was a third thing. I'm not involved in the regulatory world myself. I'm in the civil works part of the Corps in planning. And so we have a whole regulatory division. Obviously, the Corps has, through the Clean Water Act, regulatory jurisdiction. I'm not involved with that myself, but I know in terms of the permitting that was referenced by someone, clearly that's an administration priority to simplify and streamline permitting. So it's something that, again, I can be a liaison for in terms of information and knowledge. I don't deal with it myself, but it is a core, strong core interest. Yeah. C-O-R-E.
I think everybody heard that, and I noticed some smiles around the table, so thank you for being the liaison. You'll be getting some calls, I'm sure. Jenny?
One thing I forgot, it's one of those things when it's what you do day in, day out, you forget about it when bringing it up. But certainly, and you mentioned that the updates, and I think the Water Action Plan updates that really are spearheaded by the Resources Agency and Chris specifically are a really great way for us to really monitor our progress. And so kudos to Chris, and I know you're always reaching out to us to do that, and that's an important part. One big thing that we're working on this year that is identified in the Water Action Plan that we hope to make grand progress on this year is safe and affordable drinking water for all of the communities, and especially communities in the Delta. And so that is one area that we're working a lot with the Water Board on this year, and we hope to get some really good accomplishment on getting a sustainable and funding source for safe and affordable drinking waters for all of our communities.
So that provides a good segue to question number 2. You've heard examples of progress and successes. Would like to hear now what should be included in the next California Water Action Plan? What things that have gained some momentum do you want to see continued? Are there any additional initiatives that you think should be a part of a Delta plan or a California Water Action Plan? So just pretend like the next gubernatorial administration is listening and offer up your thoughts about what should be included in the next California Water Action Plan.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Please.
Thank you. As I look around this table at this committee, I'm obviously the least qualified to talk about the science, but I don't believe that's my role here at the Delta Stewardship Council or on this committee, to talk about the local perspective as it relates to all the work that you all are doing. And I have 5 points I'd like to share with you, and then maybe that will generate some discussion. I hope it will. So let me start off with my first point. You know, there's been a great deal of attention, money, and resources toward going towards some of the coequal goals. In other words, water reliability, as many of us would say, the twin tunnels, and also the ecosystem restoration, but less attention to Delta as a place. You know, and as you go about doing your planning for eco restoration projects, you need to remember that there are active agricultural endeavors, if you will, trying to make it with a patchwork of all these eco-restoration projects. And it's difficult to farm when you have these different projects being contemplated or actually underway. A more concerted focus and priority on the mechanisms that can develop new and local water supplies is key to our water future. Both the California Water Action Plan and the Delta Plan should strongly promote and incentivize stormwater capture, local storage, recycling, desal, and other programs. You know, if we were to have incentivization of different programs, not only for those here in the Northern California, but in Southern California, we may not be so reliant, as you referred to, Ms. Sobek, on the Delta and the water it provides. We need to get off the Delta's back, if you will, and look at other ways of providing the additional water that is going to be needed for this state that is approaching 40 million with an infrastructure and water storage for 20 million people. My third point, not enough is being done relative to the state mandate to reduce reliance on the Delta. This is the single biggest issue that, if addressed, would reduce impacts to species, help maintain water deliveries, and keep the Delta land uses intact. The Delta Plan and the California Water Action Plan should highlight, require consistency among coequal goals, and develop policies, those that I just made reference to. We need to incentivize other ways of creating that additional water. And I can't emphasize this enough, something that has been missing when state and federal government embarks on their projects. They need to get local government involved. Chris and I are working on a number of projects, and it's nice to be able to work with the state as a partner instead of the state telling you as local government what you have to do. I think those of us that represent local government, local constituency, understand what's going on the ground much better than a state bureaucracy. I'm not taking anything away from the state. I'm just saying that there needs to be more cooperation among state and federal partners. And as to the Delta Plan Ecosystem Amendment Update, I certainly appreciate the staff work here at the Delta Stewardship Council. The staff has been reaching out to the locals to try to figure out what it is that we can do better, how we can do it differently. And it's amazing, those of us that work at local government, when you have people coming to your podium talking about what it is that they know best, whether it's agriculture, their neighborhood parks, the issue they know best because they are personally involved and concerned for the outcome. And then I guess I would finish by saying that we would appreciate some local involvement in the interagency committee established to address development of the ecosystem amendment. And this goes not only to this subcommittee, to all the subcommittees that are embarking on work in the Delta that really needs local government and local constituency participation. So thank you, and I hope that stimulates some discussion.
Yeah, it's great, Skip. Thanks. Others?
Yeah, Skip, you made me think that I should make mention of what the Corps of Engineers is doing in Southern California. My first remarks were focused more on the Delta, but we have some innovative integrated water resources management work being done at dams in Southern California that Prado is a great example along the Santa Ana River, where we're looking at sediment management and ecosystem restoration and water conservation all together. And so the Corps definitely realizes the connection between some of the things we can do at dams or debris basins that we might own or operate or partner with people, and the extent to which they can provide more locally sourced water. It reduces the demand on the Delta. So that's definitely something we're doing.
Thank you, Randy. One thing to kind of build off what Skip had mentioned, one of the priorities for the Secretary, and as he's looking at the bureaus and really looking to kind of push authority to the field, such that those in the field within the bureaus, they have the authority because, quite frankly, they know the projects, they know what's going on better than those of us that are back in Washington, D.C. And so really a priority to the Secretary and recognizing all the hard work that takes place amongst all these participants here who understand, who live here, work here, and understand what's taking place in the Delta. And that's important to be able to have that viewpoint and have that participation by those parties. So I agree, Skip.
Anyone else? Yes.
Maybe just add, and Skip, you highlighted something for me, I think, is in the new plan, really talking about sort of the interconnectedness of the relationship between the different issues. So the difference between, water conservation helping with us respond to droughts better, or the water availability piece, or, some of the ecosystem pieces. I think from our perspective, the challenges between, fish reintroduction above Shasta actually helps from a water supply, water availability downstream of Shasta during drought periods and things like that. And I think just that interconnectedness of all of those pieces fitting together in a new plan is really useful.
Okay.
Andy?
Yes.
So I just want to add on to what folks have been talking about, not necessarily about what sort of future goals should be placed in the next iteration of the Water Action Plan, but also to remember that we're sort of nearing a transition in the governor's office, and to sort of all of us help to the extent that the new administration is not aware, to sort of underscore the importance of what the work that has already been done and the substantial resources that have been placed in, for example, the Water Quality Control Plan update at the State Water Board, which is part of which will be complete before the Brown administration is done, but part of which will not. And so to sort of help continue supporting the efforts that we've all undertaken for the last administration and continue that into the new administration. And we can all work together to do that.
Yes, Tim.
Thank you. I'm going to stick with the theme, but shift the geography just for a second, if I might, and also start with the first question, but I'll get to the second very quickly. So my key word for the first question was going to be floodplains. I'm going to tee up Chris for the rest of the agenda. It's really paramount for me in particular, and I think our group, the Flood Board. I think in November, the last time this group met, I was not here, but I'm pretty sure that Bill talked about the fact that the 5-year plan was adopted by the board, and that doesn't happen every year, obviously, so it's a big deal for us to get that done. A big part of that is the conservation strategy, which is a big, important piece of that puzzle, and talks a lot about how we can both restore the ecosystem, reestablish floodplains, which does a lot to help reduce flood risk and protect communities in the Central Valley. So it's one way we really get at all those different things and can really talk about how things should be integrated on the ground. And looking forward, the one place I think I would like to see us continue to focus, there's so much happening, but it's not tied together very well, I don't think, is in the San Joaquin Valley. If you start in the south and ask anybody who's working down there, whether they're talking about the restoration program, subsidence, groundwater, we're about to spend a lot of money in that system, and we really want to make sure that we address all those things if we can at the same time, or at least think about them so we don't trip over ourselves or do something that's going to paint ourselves into a corner. I would love to say that the vegetation management issue with the Corps is on its way to being resolved, but as long as I've been on the board, which has been 6 years now, when we started, we broke the piece that had been made in 2012, and we have never been on the same page since then. So I think it's unlikely that's going to be resolved in the near term. California took a stand and took a different position, and I think that's good for the state. It makes it very hard, I know, for the folks at the Corps, but they've been very patient and very diligent trying to work through case by case, tree by tree, those situations. And that's probably the way it's going to be for a while. That said, there's always room for improvement, and I think the San Joaquin Valley is a really important place where we could take some examples that we'll hear about from the Sacramento side, especially YOLO, and if we could repeat those places and replace those events in those places south of the Delta, we'd make a lot of progress.
Yes, John.
So from the science perspective, I think one important thing that we're already aware of, but really we always need to keep thinking about is climate change issues. And so really for the Delta plan, for the ecosystem amendment, where that's one of the synthesis papers is around climate change because of that awareness. But I think we can't reiterate it enough that we need to be thinking long term, and we really need to keep our eye on that. Both immediate issues in the coming, decade or two, and then much longer term issues.
Carl?
Yeah, just to reiterate a previous comment I made relative to the going forward with the Water Action Plan and the Delta Plan, as part of the ecosystem amendment, particularly looking at incorporating what's been generated through the Delta Conservation Framework into that, because it really is, I guess much to my surprise, really focused on how you work together as opposed to making specific recommendations about a particular kind of activity. And it sets the stage for looking at, on a more localized or regional basis, conservation strategies that address multiple benefits, whether it's flood or ecosystem or community sustainability, agricultural sustainability, and move those forward in a way that reflects the local community as opposed to a broader, let's say, mandate or whatever. And so I think that's a very valuable component that needs to be carried forward.
Okay. Yes, Dave.
I think continuing to work together to advance our monitoring networks so we can better understand what the fish populations are doing, how they're behaving, and how they're interacting both with our water operations and other elements of habitat and the environment.
Good. Chris or Cindy, I was going to save Chris for last, so Cindy?
I'll go quickly, and mostly just to echo things that other folks have said, but multi-beneficial projects, I think, are very key moving forward. I know we're looking at those, but kind of taking them to a new level. And one thing, and I think this is probably because, at least in our department, we have a lot of people retiring and taking institutional knowledge with them, but if we can capture some of the critical lessons learned, and I know, Barry, you mentioned drought, and so it got me thinking about when, we've gone through this last drought and the task force and the working together, the various agencies, YOLO bypass and the work there, but maybe there's some ways to kind of capture some lessons learned and some templates for as we move forward and we experience these kind of events again, I think would be really very helpful.
These are all good points, and Seth is busy taking notes, so we'll form them into some sort of a high-level briefing paper to come later. Eco-Restore has been mentioned by several of you. It's a project, an initiative that we have highlighted here at each of our meetings since it was created in April of 2015. I've asked Chris Chernell to provide us with an update and to introduce a new resource on the team.
Great, thanks, Randy. And maybe just immediately before I do that, if I can just make a quick comment or addition to that last conversation, if that's okay with you. When thinking about the question of how to inform or what the next water action plan should look like, at least to answer that portion of the question, I have to think back, I think we all have to think back to the origins of this water action plan and what what was the stage set like? What was the context? What was the charge given to the three agencies who developed it? And, you know, there's a lot of probably paranoia-driven mindset of my own, oftentimes, which is well, how do we, prior to a new state administration coming in, where there's a lot of uncertainty, at least from my perspective, how do we get in these really good things to make sure the momentum carries forward? And try to get that done as quickly as possible in a way that kind of, you know, sneaks it in, so when the new administration comes, they don't have to do any work. Here's the Water Action Plan, you know, 2.0, ready to go. And I think there's probably some validity in that basic idea of setting the stage for a new administration. But, you know, to the extent that something is, you know, paranoia driven, it's probably not that great of an idea in the first place, right? So stepping back another step for me, it's, you know, why is this thing so successful? It is a 20 odd page document that lays out in essentially single paragraphs a list of actions to be taken. And I think a lot of it is successful because there is a tremendous amount of ownership of the content of this material. Yes, the governor asked the three agencies to work together, but this was it was a pretty intimate process putting together the different, you know, actions within here. They are not random. There's a lot of personal input, a lot of expertise, and those within this administration and hopefully beyond, and what I can tell, especially from the federal partners, but also local as well, is that's really been felt, that there is a lot of ownership to this, there's meaning in it, and this is all just to say, and I don't really know exactly where I would take this recommendation or how to articulate it maybe as clearly as I should, but maybe the question is, how do we, once the new administration comes in, empower them to do what this administration did as well? Learning the lessons, incorporating the lessons of you know, the first go around with this water action plan, but not necessarily writing it for them, because I think there's a lot of value, again, just to be redundant, but I think it's, at least from my perspective, an important point. You know, how do you use plans like this that by themselves probably aren't all that useful, except to the extent that you can rally around them and have ownership in them and say, I, or at least my boss, had some role in the development of this, therefore this is my charge. And you don't do that if you necessarily, at least if you only rely on writing something prior to a new administration and hoping that the next one picks it up. That's a crapshoot, and I think we can do a lot better than that. And that's really what I'm looking forward to is how do we, you know, transcend the transition of administrations and set that up for continued momentum. So.
Well, and Chris, that's why we've teed the conversation up in April and not waited until November.
Right.
Because every agency represented around this table should have some lessons learned, some thoughtful input for the next administration. So we'll be working with each of your agencies to highlight the key features that we think that the next administration should come in prepared to address somehow, some way. I don't have the exact method either, but we've got 6 months to work on it, and so I really appreciate the conversation that you all have contributed to around this table. There's a lot of good suggestions beyond just maintaining momentum for the plans that exist today.
Yeah, it's the right question. So back to your actual question to me. So I believe that there's been a Eco-Restore presentation given to the DPIIC ever since its inception. I think that I've been up at that table every 6 months for the last number of years without fail. And I don't have a long presentation today by any stretch of the imagination. I do want to transition to a colleague of mine in a minute, but I will just say that a lot of what was just raised, especially by you, Mr. Supervisor, about you know, to really be successful, and Carl mentioned this as well as part of the Delta framework, you know, how do we start incorporating into project development at the ground floor, if you will, these other interests, right? How do we move beyond the presumption that a project is going to be necessarily at odds with XYZ interests? And how do we, either using the next iteration of the Water Action Plan or just how we do business, to change that dynamic into one that says we'll probably be more successful in, let's say, an ecosystem restoration project if we do so in a way that maybe also tries to solve some local issues as well. And moving beyond this, you know, rebuttable presumption that there is necessarily a conflict, and saying how can we design it from the beginning so that it's more successful all around. We've made a lot of progress in that basic realm in the Eco-Restore program over the last number of years, working with essentially all of you around the table. Again, I don't have a big presentation here today by any stretch of the imagination. I will say that we continue to make really good progress in the YOLO bypass. Again, in large part because of, for example, a budding, it's nascent now, but I think ultimately it'll be developing into something that's truly implementable. You know, a conversation between your staff supervisor and the folks that work with Carl and for Carl at CDFW. How do we, at the same time as the state and federal agencies and others want to move big restoration projects, say, in the lower YOLO bypass region, how do we also address the concerns of the agricultural community that are exacerbated by the idea of bringing additional threatened and endangered species to that neck of the woods? Turns out there are some pretty well-established tools for doing that. They can be challenging, they can maybe be expensive, but ultimately the challenge is one for us to work through, because I think that will be the ultimate limiter of success, is our willingness or not to struggle through some of those challenges. And so I just want to report that there's been a lot of good dialogue that is really of a different nature than there's been in the past, Mr. Chair, and that's a really exciting thing, and I think that we're going to see in the next number of years a lot of progress on a big scale, not necessarily just the near-term projects that I've been reporting on to this committee a lot over the last couple of years, but really how do we start rolling out, and when we start rolling out these big multi-benefit projects of the multiple thousands of acres type scale. And it's those types of conversations that I both appreciate and recognize as being critical for that. So thank you. And we are listening and can always do better, I'm sure, but looking forward to that dialogue in the future. So that's a lot of looking forward, but what I want to actually talk about a little bit today, and won't actually be me talking about it, is what's really planned for 2018. So where are we in the implementation of the Eco-Restore objectives as they were originally articulated? And for that, I just want to introduce briefly, and I'll let him give any details that he wants to, but I'm going to introduce Mike Roberts. He's a new addition to the California Natural Resources Agency team. He is the Special Assistant for Delta Restoration. As some of you will remember, and there's been a little bit of a gap, but we used to have a fine gentleman by the name of David Okita on board at agency who really helped us think through and work through some of the biggest institutional challenges to getting large-scale restoration done. Mike is his replacement, and just really excited to introduce him to you today, to hear what he has to say, for you to grill him a little bit on what his job is and how he sees his work ahead. But it's a big addition to the team. He comes by way of DWR, so thank you and sorry for that. And I think that we will all see even more progress because of it. So if you don't mind, just to introduce him, and looking forward to the conversation.
Mike, Mr. Chair, before we get started with Mr. Roberts, I just want to quickly respond to Chris's comments. Chris's involvement in some of the local projects have really made them more successful than they would have been, because we would still be fighting over where we start. And I think Chris has done a great job of bringing locals together with the state. We're not always on the same page, but at least it's an attempt to have local government involved. And also Carl and Brooke, I think they've done a great job of reaching out to local stakeholders and making sure their issues are addressed, and reasonably well. So I wanted to just comment that, my comments were not that we're always fighting, but we're standing on things that we as the locals feel are important and they deserve to be listened to. So thank you to both of you.
Chairman Fiorini and committee members, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. These are really challenging discussions to try and follow. I won't take up too much of your time today. I just want to make a couple of points, and this is a bit of a plug for project implementation through the Eco-Restore program. As Chris noted, many of you are familiar with the program. You probably recall the three components of it: the regional planning focus to pull in local engagement in the process, a focus on project implementation to get some things done, and then an adaptive management component to make sure we're back-checking how we're proceeding. So there are a lot of different aspects I could touch on today, but I want to focus on the project implementation piece because, as Chris mentioned, 2018 is going to be a big year for the Eco-Restore initiative. We've got about half dozen sites that are very likely to break ground sometime this year in some form. So this is a bit of a plug to all of you to stay the course with us for a bit and make sure that we can complete this project implementation aspect of EcoRestore. And I just want to emphasize a few points why this is such an important aspect for us to focus on in the context of the remaining habitats that we've got out there. Every single project that we can get in the ground makes a significant contribution to those values, both for people and for our natural resources of California. So that's the first part. Every single project is individually making a big difference. But a second part of the EcoRestore effort and why these projects are so helpful is I think it's going to be a hallmark of the initiative that these projects are the proving grounds where we identify some of the institutional barriers that have made these projects so difficult to implement. And many of you have probably been aware of some of these projects for potentially decades. So these are really hard things to get done. So a focus of the initiative is to try and figure out how we can either streamline, whether it's permitting, contracting processes, funding sources. So every one of these projects contributes to that overall effort of how we get better of doing these things in the future, so it's not working through a bunch of one-off challenges. And then the last point that I would make is we're going to hear some discussion about where restoration needs to go next and where EcoRestore evolves to in the future. I think regardless of where that goes, and I don't know the answers to that, so I'm looking forward to that discussion, but I think wherever it goes, we're still very likely to need these places on the ground. Whether it's we evolve towards process-based restoration or some other concepts, we're still going to need the places to conduct the actions, carry out the monitoring, and then look back and see how we did to chart that course forward. So I think wherever our EcoRestore program ends up going, it's going to be a yes and, not necessarily an either or to, you know, compared to what we've done now we're going to do this instead. I think it's going to be in addition to. So I will just end with a call to action for all of you, just to help us stay the course and try and finish off getting the full suite of the EcoRestore projects in the ground. That's about all I had to share today.
Mike, thanks. We appreciate your leadership. Glad you're here to help. Any questions of Mike or Chris? Tim?
I'm going to throw you a softball, I think.
Which I'll probably defer to Chris.
That's okay. The second example you mentioned about trying to look at things that have been done, learn from them, and where can we be more efficient next time. Think about, maybe talk just for a second about Hamilton City.
Sure.
And the project there and what might be done differently someplace else. This is a local area that had a lot of local support for a project that's still waiting for the project in a lot of ways.
Yeah. I don't know if that's a softball or not. I think it does speak to the emphasis on the and importance of local engagement, and that's where I would go with that question first, because I think, so to provide a little bit of background, I participated with the Army Corps of Engineers, local folks, DWR, on the Hamilton City multipurpose project for about 10 years, and the project has gone on longer than that, and it is now actually in construction, so that's a great thing. At the time, it was the first application of the Corps' multipurpose benefit guideline, or multipurpose project guidelines. So we worked through a lot of unknowns on how to do these things better in the future. But I think one of the things that has always stuck with me was how key it was to have the locals involved in that project, down into the weeds of, we're going to have a meeting on what the hydraulic modeling results were. And we would pull the locals into that meeting and walk through the results, and wouldn't stop the conversation until they understood where we were going and why. That has always stuck with me as one of the pieces of that project that we need to fully apply elsewhere.
Okay. Mike, thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.
Unless anyone else has anything else to offer on this agenda item, I'm going to conclude that we agree that the Water Action Plan, the Delta Plan have been useful, helpful, and that we don't want to see the momentum that has been gained to wane. So we're going to do what we can do in the next 6 months to develop some talking points to help encourage the next administration to maintain the momentum. and build upon the good works that you all have identified. So, on to agenda item number 3, a future delta. At the last DPIIC meeting, we agreed to support efforts to update Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan. The chapter focused on the ecosystem, and to continue supporting collaborative approaches to restoration solutions. It's time to continue this dialogue and really start to think about some of the larger issues related to an integrated and ecosystem function-based approach to restoration. To this end, we've invited Dr. Jeff Mount from the PPIC to provide an overview of the restoration ideas recently put forth in a series of blog posts, all of which are available in your binder. And following Jeff's comments, we've got a couple of questions teed up. I'm going to ask him to stay at the presenters table because I'd like to include him as a part of this discussion that we will have. So, Jeff, whatever you tell us, you're going to have to be prepared to discuss later. Welcome.
Thanks, Randy, and thanks for inviting me today. I want to give a little bit of background for those blog bombs that we sent out in successive weeks. First of all, I want to state that I hate blogs as a venue for science. It's second only in evilness compared to PowerPoint science, and the worst of all, tweet science. But at the time we were faced with a very, very short deadline, and as most of you know PPIC, we normally send our stuff out for peer review, and we do a fairly long and involved, sometimes painful process. But some members of the administration asked us to weigh in, to put together a group of people to weigh in with just ideas as to how to deal with the Water Quality Control Plan and its objectives for the Delta. So, and I want to make sure that what you're hearing from me, and in those blog pieces, you'll notice the word water fix didn't appear in those blog pieces because we were principally focused on the question of trying to get to negotiated solutions of voluntary agreements or to help in those discussions for the Water Quality Control Plan. So, I mean, I'm happy to talk about water fix if you want. I've only been talking about it for 20 years, but that is not the focus of the blog science we did. So, I'm going to be brief because Randy says I'm to help stimulate a conversation amongst you, and maybe hopefully not so much at me, but between each other, and give you essentially the 5 recommendations that were embedded within those blog pieces. Recommendation number 1 starts with the context, which is something you are very familiar with, is all problems in the Delta are equal. And it's like saying, I love each of my children equally. I love each of my Delta problems equally. And we pushed back on that notion, this group that we put together. And that is, no, they're not. And in fact, that's part of the problem is that you don't prioritize problems in the Delta and decide which ones can be can be addressed in a reasonable amount of time. So we set an arbitrary deadline for ourselves, which was 15 years. And in that 15-year period, we said it might be better if you concentrated resources, not all resources, but concentrated resources on biting off things you might be able to chew within that 15 years and using that to basically inform your plans for the next 15 to 20 to 30 years. Because the Delta's problems, as we all know, will never be solved. Not ever. You're just simply adapting to these problems, learning from them, and continuing to manage them. So we actually said if we were forced to sit down and decide what those plans are that you could make significant progress in, and this is, again, the focus is on ecosystem. I should have said that from the beginning. The idea was all about ecosystems. What would you look at? And we go to the most fundamental problem within the Delta, and that's food web productivity. And that the issue of food web productivity of the group that we assembled remained as a top issue in the Delta. Carl knows this well. All of you know this well. This is an issue that keeps getting kicked around all over the place. It's insufficiently productive to create desirable conditions, ecosystem conditions in the Delta. That was problem number 1. The second was the problem number 2, again, which we think is a digestible problem, is that ecosystem conditions favor non-native plants and animals to the detriment of native plants and animals, and not even that. I want to say desirable. This is following the notion of Peter Morrill, that some non-native animals or plants are desirable in this system. But it's noticed the undesirable plants and animals are an ecosystem condition. And then the third, we threw something over the wall for you all to think about. And that is, what has not gotten sufficient attention in the last 10 years, but we think is likely to create significant problems in the next decade, is this harmful algal bloom problem that has really cropped up in spades in the last 10 years. And by the way, this is a global phenomenon. It's not just in the Delta. This is happening in lots of places. It's even happening in our reservoirs here in California, and we don't know what's going on well, but we know it's going to be a serious problem, and the current trends are that it's going to get much worse. This affects everything. So it isn't just ecosystems per se, but it's the humans who reside in those ecosystems, and people who recreate, people who drink water from the Delta. This is a big problem. So we said those are the three problems that we said you would emphasize. That doesn't mean you give up on everything else. It's just this is the emphasis. In fact, you're going to hear that theme throughout it. So that was recommendation number one. Concentrate effort over a 15-year period on really trying to make headway on three principal problems. The second one is that, and has certainly gotten us in plenty of trouble, but that's okay, is this notion that what it boils down to, although Supervisor, you may feel differently about this, but most of the thing people fight about most on the big scale, of course, is freshwater flows, and particularly freshwater outflows from the Delta. And we, after a lot of, well, in 3 weeks' time, of internal debate, said, we think we got that wrong. That in fact, it's the way we allocate fresh water, both its timing and its geography, which is probably much, much more important. And so we recommended a sort of a shift in thinking about this, and this was as much to our scientific colleagues as anyone else, to stop focusing on volumes of outflow on a monthly basis or even an annual basis, but really the geographic distribution of freshwater flows, and to try and get the highest return on investment of those freshwater flows. You're going to hear this notion of efficiency in multiple things that I mentioned. The second aspect of that recommendation, and tied to it, inextricably tied to it, is managing tides. Each time we said that, people would roll their eyes and, what are you going to do, control the moon? No, what we mean by that, this is a finite amount of tidal energy within the Delta, and it is a powerful force that dwarfs the freshwater within the Delta, and that we tend to try to live with it. That's the best way to describe it, rather than harness it. In our small group, we developed a whole bunch of novel ideas for how to harness tidal energy, which will achieve extremely high ecosystem benefits. And I'm going to give you some examples in a second. So that is the notion of tidal energy as a resource rather than a constraint. So that when Eileen is sitting there talking to her board about beneficial use, imagine this, the unimaginable, that tides are part of a public trust resource. And the energy of tides are a resource. And then, of course, the third one is managing landscapes. And this is the one that produces heartburn, particularly for in-delta interests. But our argument is that you cannot manage freshwater flows and manage tides at the same time in the most efficient way without making major investments in landscape changes. So physical changes to the land to be able to direct those flows so you get the highest return on their investment. That was recommendation 2. Recommendation 3 was something that you have already kicked around, and it's kind of one of those things where we're all talking about it. It's like the weather, we all talk about it, nobody does anything about it, but we are all talking about it, and that is the notion of an ecosystem-based approach to management of the Delta. It is a fair criticism that single species management dominates Delta discussions. And what we are saying, when we said, which was the unsayable, we said that a number of those species are now, their population numbers are so low that we can no longer rely on them as indicators of success in the Delta. And indeed, Delta smelt's probably the best example of that, that their population numbers are so low that you can make major investments in the Delta and you are highly unlikely to see a response, a measurable response. That should change your objectives in the Delta. And our argument in this blog we wrote is that your objectives should shift away from single species. By the way, you got plenty of pushback on that notion that we already do ecosystem-based management because we're just doing it for these single species. But that you shift to a more broader set of objectives, ecosystem-based objectives, and measures for those ecosystem attributes that you're trying to create. We, as you all have listened to my colleague Peter Moyle over the years, you have a novel ecosystem. There's nothing like it. There's no analog anywhere else in the world, and there's no analog in history, so you are, in fact, inventing an ecosystem. You are creating an ecosystem. So you need to set clear guidelines on what those attributes would be in order to create ecosystem function, desirable ecosystem function, less of an emphasis on population of fishes. So having said that, Peter Moyle then objected strongly in it says, no, it's all about fish. So we've asked some back and forth. We eventually got to, all right, if you're going to use fish as one of your indicators of ecosystem functions, you want to shift away from these low population numbers and focus on migratory native fish. Think like longfin is a good example. No, excuse me, not longfin. Sorry, splittail. Oh, please, not longfin. I'll get to that. Things like splittail, which migrate up and down the system. Sturgeon, for example, and multiple races of runs of salmon within the system. These are your best indicators of your ecosystem condition, and of course, then you can shape your functions around it. And then, as you'll see here in a second, there's also the terrestrial side of this, which comes in. So we wanted to make clear, we think that we're all talking about ecosystem-based management of the delta, but we're not defining it. And so we're encouraged, a recommendation to you would be to define it. And so in the water quality control plan, and I'm sorry I'm looking at you, Eileen, but you're here, in the water quality control plan, this is actually an opportunity to define it. That the historical approach, which focuses principally on minimum in-stream flows and narrowly defined water quality standards, is too rigid, too inflexible, and not ecosystem-based. And so as your staff, and I know they're working very hard on this, this is something for them to chew on as they're trying to describe this system. So that's one recommendation. The fourth is then, this is going to cause some pain for my good friend Tim Ramirez here in a second. The fourth is this notion of concentrated effort. And concentrated effort on those three goals that I described for you originally, and now what kind of landscape investments do you do? And our argument was that the priority investments, and by the way, this is embedded in part in Eco-Restore as well, the priority investments should be in those places that create the highest return on investment, that we take sort of a risk-based approach and try to get the biggest bang for the buck rather than trying to solve all problems partially across the delta. And so because of that, this notion of food web productivity, habitat, and water quality, particularly around harmful algal blooms, we ended up with 6 recommendations that need to be looked at, 5 of which are really habitat-based. And let me just briefly mention them, because this is part of what you're already doing. This is embedded in a lot of work that Fish and Wildlife and others have done. We have no surprises in here for you guys, other than the notion that what we're thinking about is managing freshwater flows, managing tidal energy at the same time, and adjusting the landscape to manage all 3 simultaneously. Obviously, the flood bypass issue. Our argument is all of the concentrated efforts should be now in the North Delta Arc, which stretches from Sassoon all the way over to McCormick-Williams Tract and up the bypasses. That leaves out places like the San Joaquin, and I explain why that doesn't mean you abandon the San Joaquin. Our principle is you keep working in the San Joaquin, but that you concentrate on the North Delta Arc, because landscape conditions, availability of water are likely to produce near-term investments. And near-term is 15 years. Look, remember when half of us were at the table in CalFed 20 years ago. These things take a tremendous amount of time. So flood bypasses, obviously the Yola bypass and the Sutter bypass, have exceptionally high return on investment possibilities. Too bad it's taking so long, but there's really something pretty extraordinary as an opportunity within there. We talked about terminal channel systems. Carl Wilcox will know immediately what I'm talking about. These are the dead-end channels that you see, and particularly in parts of the North Delta. You also find them in Sassoon, which are extremely high productivity. So they have that characteristic of very high food web productivity, lots of native fish, tremendous potential, management of those, including with, and particularly in the North Delta, these concentrated freshwater flows to basically rejuvenate them periodically has high value. Shallow open water habitat is often ignored. It's considered a death trap because it's full of non-native species and a variety of miserable plants. Actually, talking to the folks in this committee, they say, no, we got that all wrong. We can actually manage the tides in there and small investments of freshwater, concentrated freshwater flows, to actually improve their productivity, their primary productivity, and their role in habitat. Tidal transition zones, we don't like to talk about it, but I know Eco-Restore, it's being considered, and it certainly was a big deal in BDCP before it turned into Water Fix. And this is the notion that as fish move down the Sacramento River, they eventually transition from a riverine system to a tidal system. And that the worst place is that transition. And those transition zones are absolutely key for improving survivorship of these migratory fishes. And so we argue a lot about this, but again, in the blog we try to say you might want to rethink your approach to that. You can use tidal restoration in Sassoon Marsh to actually manage your tidal transition zones, which are quite a long distance away from that. So this is, again, harnessing tidal energy to soften and spread out those tidal transition zones. So we suggested that. And then, of course, the top of the list is the iconic tidal marsh restoration, whether it's in the North Delta or in Sassoon Marsh, or even in places as far as the Cosumnes River. This has very high value, we think, but we know it has tremendous value from marsh habitat per se, and how much that will produce in terms of primary productivity and habitat quality. It depends on how you manage it. And then last, the sixth recommendation was we didn't have a recommendation. We were really stumped. And it was great to see smart people like Wim Kimmerer and Jim Klern and others sit there and grapple with this problem of harmful algal blooms. We know it's a problem. And again, I'm looking at you, Eileen. We know it's a problem. We know it's on the horizon. We know your agency's going to have to deal with this thing. We just don't have an answer for you and what to do about it at this point. So I think you need an initiative at this point that says this is a problem. It's getting worse. It's not clear why. It might be just temperature driven. I mean, it might be something as simple as temperature driven, but it's probably nutrient driven. And this is what we've got to study. And oh, by the way, I do want to remind you, the conversation, this is relevant to all of you. We are about to conduct the biggest experiment in the history of the Delta. And that is going to be shutting off Sac Regional. The water quality changes that will occur with Sac Regional will tell us an immense amount about how the Delta works. Are we ready for that? That seems like something ought to go in a water quality control plan. I'm just saying. So that's recommendation 4. Recommendation 5, you asked us not to dwell on this, so Randy, I will not, because the next group is going to focus on science. So we made a series of recommendations for why we think the current science infrastructure is not capable of handling a progressive ecosystem-based water quality control plan. And again, we got in private conversations with you what was behind that thinking, but those of you who've listened to me for years whining about science and know what most of that is. We suggested that the only entity that we think has the stature and broad support and the capacity to take on something like this, to be directed to take something on like this, is in fact the Delta Science Program. That no one agency, because of agency conflicts, can possibly do it in an integrated way across the board. So we suggested elevating the Delta Science Program to take on that role of being in charge of it. But the second and most important aspect, which I may or may not come in the conversations that come after this, is all of you who've been engaged in the Delta all the way back to 2008 remember where we hit the absolute nadir of science, and that was the evolution of combat science in the Delta, where individuals, whether they were organizations or whatever, were funding science to basically go to war against each other. A lot has changed in the last few years. The amount of community science that's developing and cooperative agendas is testament to the fact that so much has changed since that time. So we're arguing that the way you fund and organize it is through a joint powers authority, which has both the regulators and the regulateds involved, and as well as the stakeholders, and the federal government can sit on that as members of the board. So we suggest that that's what you do to fund it. And Carl, you might want to think about that as a model for how you start funding eco-restore, so that it could be done faster, because it'd be a JPA, it's not government. I mean, it is government, it functions like government, but it's much more nimble and faster, lots faster. So something to keep in mind. So that was on the science. Lastly, the group then punted to a very, very important question, which I think has to be considered by you as we hear these discussions, and that is the question of whether ecosystem-based management is even legal. And there's a national debate on all of this, that in fact Endangered Species Act issues, or Clean Water Act issues, trump an ecosystem-based approach. And an ecosystem-based approach is one which basically tries to integrate the human uses of the ecosystem and the natural ecosystem you're trying to create, or the novel ecosystem you're trying to create, and the attributes of that ecosystem. And is that even legal? or are we forced basically to follow Clean Water Act rules and Endangered Species Act rules, and that's really just how we're going to manage things, which always puts us toward these minimum in-stream flows and minimum water quality standards, which are too rigid in our view to be able to manage the delta in any kind of adaptive way. So folks like me stepped out of the room, and smart people came in, and this was led by Brian Gray, who's also at PPIC, but involved Will Stell, former NOAA Fisheries, and Leon Septicki from Stanford. And so the three of them sat down, and we asked them that question, and they went away and they wrote the fourth of our 3 blog series, and that was on whether or not this is legal. I can summarize their results pretty simply. It's legal if the agencies say it is. And that's about it. There is nothing in the law that would prevent Eileen's group from saying, we're going to take an ecosystem-based approach, and by doing this, we will achieve the objectives that are set out in the Clean Water Act, and we'll meet the broader ESA Act questions, right? Porter Cologne and California ESA. So if the agencies say so, it is so. And that's very glib, I realize, but you can look at their analysis. But there's nothing in the Clean Water Act. There's nothing in the Endangered Species Act. There's nothing in the Porter Cologne Act, for example, or California Endangered Species Act, with some small exception, which would prevent you from taking an ecosystem-based approach as long as it's scientifically defensible. I think that's the simplest thing. So in summary. It's great, by the way, listening to your conversations. We continue to make progress on these issues, but remember, we had 3 weeks to write this, so it was a very short turnaround. Hasn't gone through peer review that we would normally do. So, and that's fine. It was really just reflecting the professional judgment of the people sitting on that committee. We think you've got to take a short-term focus rather than a long-term focus, but you've got to do both. I mean, the point is, though, and short-term focus means one thing and one thing alone: set priorities. And those are difficult and painful and forces people into unpleasant decisions. We suggest you shift away from an overemphasis on freshwater flows, particularly outflow of the delta as a principal measure of success, but really concentrated freshwater flows tied together with managing tidal energy and landscapes so that's targeted. And we've argued that your highest chance of success is in the North Delta. That's where you are likely to get the biggest return on investment and learn the most about the process along the way. And again, that's part of that ecosystem approach. We talked about linking together floodplains, dead-end channels, shallow open water habitat, tidal transition zones, tidal marsh, and then this looming unpleasantness that's out there on these microcystis invasions, these harmful algal blooms, is this few members of the scientific community that I have a tremendous amount of respect for waving a flag and saying you've got to start worrying about that. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks.
Jeff, thanks. That is a good start. Just a reminder to the committee, the theme of this agenda item is identifying the desired future and vision for restoration and recovery. Your comments are going to help shape the update to the ecosystem chapter in the Delta Plan. Jeff's given us a lot to think about, and you'll recall you had some homework. You had 2 questions to drive this conversation. The first is, our current approaches and requirements for delta restoration, considering species, ecosystems, and human uses, converging toward an integrated vision of a restored delta. So, simplified, how are we doing?
I was just interested in asking a question first before we get into the discussion a little bit. And Jeff, I was curious, this issue of prioritization across species or across geographies or across areas is something that vexes us up and down the coast, and trying to deal with that. In your discussions, did you have a sense of sort of that balance of how much effort to put into the prioritization piece and concentrating effort versus sort of that trying to maintain or sort of keep going at some base level some of these other areas or some of the other species? Did you have a discussion about
Well,
range there?
since the total amount of time we met was about 9 hours, no. And that would have been disingenuous for us to try since we haven't the knowledge to do that.
So Jeff, I have a question to try to put in context. You know, my view is that we're making substantial progress, that we...
Your mic just cut out.
So use Chris's here. Hopefully works better there. You know, it's this prioritization in near-term versus long-term. And I think my view is that if we're not thinking about what things look like in 2100 or beyond, and we're not focusing the actions that we need to take now on that future, we're wasting our time. So I'd just like to get maybe clarification about how you look at the prioritization, and is that just a prioritization in itself, and how we might proceed?
No, that's a fair question. I mean, we're all going to be long dead and gone by the time we actually know whether we've done a good job or not. I guess that's liberating in a sense, but we're just not going to be around to see the long-term effects. To be clear, Carl, and I was trying to be very short on this, we don't imagine that you can't have a long-term, I mean, you have to have a long-term vision for the Delta. I think 2100 is too long. 2050 is probably a reasonable because things are going to change. I mean, for sure we know that the uncertainties are high and things are going to change. So you have to have a long-term plan. And then you're going to have to make some decisions how to make some progress in it. I think one of the problems we felt, and I think the group felt fairly strongly, is that, Carl, you are making good progress, but mostly on the planning side of it and thinking side of it. In terms of the on-the-ground actions, some people would push back that there hasn't been a tremendous amount of on the ground. Since we remember our great enthusiasm 20 years ago for all of this, that the Delta, in the Delta itself, has not been a lot of that progress. Our argument to concentrate things in the North Delta was to produce linked actions, which I think is exactly in the plan that you guys have here. You completely recognize that. It's in your work, Carl, that you guys are doing in your planning. Everybody recognizes it does no good to do a series of isolated gardening projects, that they have to be linked together. And so I think everybody agrees with that. And our proposal was focus on getting those linked projects together in the North Delta so that you can some near-term successes and learn from it, not while you abandon, for example, the San Joaquin or anywhere else, but you keep working in those areas, but that you concentrate your efforts. And it gets to Barry's question of how much do you concentrate in that? But I would say, Carl, you're doing a good job of planning at this point, but it's taking way too long to get things going on the ground and to get those contiguous linked efforts. I mean, so here's a criticism to deal with. When you look at the Eco-Restore map, there is a lot of disconnection in the Eco-Restore maps when we looked at what projects might get on the ground, and that's because they're projects of opportunity, principally projects of opportunity. We would encourage you to accelerate the linking, the physical linking of these areas, and of course, and our recommendation was to make sure that freshwater flows are part of that consideration along with tidal energy. I don't know if that satisfies your question or not.
Well, yeah, I think it does in a way. And I think, I don't want my comment to be misconstrued in that we don't plan now, but that what we plan now and implement now is contributing to something that has some resilience in the future.
Yep, and we would agree, and we had that discussion. That's why we concentrated on the North Delta, the North Delta arc, because they get your probabilities of having something very durable, and I don't want to. I worry about the use of the term resilient, but adaptable to the kinds of changes that are coming would be highest there.
Can I make one suggestion?
Yes.
About how to link. I'm sure that our former flood board member would appreciate this. From my standpoint, what you've described is what's happening. I mean, the effort is on the North Delta. Chris is a good example of that. I would love to clone Chris and have a San Joaquin Chris, but there's no San Joaquin component to that. But one thing for me that I think we have not provided, the board or the state has not provided, that would link those things together, is everybody's talking about making the Yolo bypass more of everything, right? More habitat, more species, more space for floods. But we have not said how much conveyance capacity we'd like to have for the future Yolo bypass. So there's no connection. All the projects are making it incrementally better, but we haven't said how much better it needs to be. So from my standpoint, that's one way to connect the dots, and we haven't done that, and that's in large part our responsibility, the board and the state to a lesser extent, since we are the state. So there's that. So maybe you could speak to that. And just a quick thought in the San Joaquin, I'm not sad about the comment to focus on the Sacramento. That's always been the place to focus because people love the Sacramento, and there's more to be done, I think, because what's the right way to say this? It provides opportunities for a lot more people to do a lot more things than the San Joaquin does. The San Joaquin's a hard place to work on these topics, I think, for all the reasons that people know about. And I keep thinking about what happened in '97, and that not much has changed since the floods of '97 in the San Joaquin Valley in particular. And we know that the future hydrology is not going to be what it was in the past. And with that in mind, it's more concerning, I think, from our standpoint, to think about the future of the people and the places that are in that area of the valley. And so, you know, I know you guys had to focus, but from my standpoint, so much has been done on the one side, and I would hate to see us take any attention that we provided already to the San Joaquin off of it. And one last question for you. Productivity and the algal blooms. Those things could be perceived as inconsistent.
Right.
So how do we get that?
Yeah, okay, so to be clear, when I'm talking about food web productivity, I'm talking about the food web productivity we know supports the ecosystems in the Delta. Harmful algal blooms are highly disruptive to that. In fact, they're an aberration of that level. One could argue that Delta is very productive. Look at all that Egeria out there. I mean, look at all that water hyacinth. Well, that's the wrong kind of productivity. So I didn't want to get into a discussion of the details of food web productivity, but it is the normal food web productivity so that's, yeah, you're right. We could view harmful algal blooms as great productivity. It's terrible green color and bad for everybody. No, we're not talking about that. On the San Joaquin, I'm going to let you on the San Joaquin side, our argument all along is you keep working on the San Joaquin. In many ways, you don't give up on salmon in the San Joaquin, for example. You just keep working on it. We're going to learn a lot in the North Delta, and in 15 years, we're going to have some ideas along that time for how to go forward. And then finally, Tim and the Army Corps of Engineers, I was a member of the flood board. Many years ago, I was fired with enthusiasm by Arnold Schwarzenegger, terminated by the Terminator. And oh gosh, I remember that Hamilton City project so well. It was so exciting, and here we are still. You have a problem in this committee, and that is your agency functions don't function at the same pace, nor are the demands the same, and this is what you have to do, is somehow integrate it. So Tim, I'm going to give you my honest opinion, and we've known each other many years. It takes too damn long to get a flood project to work, and you got to do something before that flood project comes around. So I know Yolo bypass is going forward. You have probably one of the nation's most progressive flood plans is out there. I wonder how many of the people in this committee have actually read it. I mean, it's extraordinary in its breadth, its scope, and its modern aspect of it, but I don't see it being incorporated into this thinking here. But an actual flood project, especially if it has a federal partner, takes too damn long.
I would agree, and I'd be happy later to talk about how we can make it faster. Let me just leave the one thought, which is the answer to Randy's question. I think the requirements are the same. The approaches are perhaps unique and different, right? We have people now focused on regional efforts, trying to connect projects together, and that's different, and that's great. But fundamentally, all the requirements are the same. We just permitted a very small restoration project, which took months of discussion, which was not that big of a deal, but it didn't fit into our boxes. There was no box for us to check. So we had to sort of figure out a way to do that with the number 2 pencil so we could erase it someday if we had to, which is better than it was 20 years ago because the board just wouldn't permit them.
Right.
They would say, no, we can't do that because it's bad for flood. So the approach is different, but the requirements, I think, by and large, are the same, and we're trying to find novel ways to address the requirements as best we can.
In fairness, and Tim will appreciate this, I am speaking only for myself when I talk about that stuff. Our group Didn't even discuss the flood plan, right? It was all about Eileen's stuff. It was all about the water quality control plan.
And I was going to briefly jump in from the Corps of Engineers. It would be remiss for me not to highlight that your sentiments are some we have heard before in terms of taking a long time. And obviously our projects have to compete nationally for funds, and I won't get into all the budgetary considerations, but there is a huge effort that's been going on a few years to finish studies more quickly, to prioritize construction projects that are ongoing and finish them. I mean, I can definitely speak. Our new Director of Civil Works is actually out and visiting us tomorrow, and that's something we're talking about, risk-informed decision-making and how do we finish within, as you may have heard, 3 years and 3 million. It's this broad general metric that we try to reach that maybe sounds really long and expensive to some folks. That's really short and quick from where we operate. And so we're trying to get at that. That's my only point.
Dan?
So Jeff, why 15 years?
Oh, okay, so, okay. When the administration said, hey, would you all get together and think about this? And we said, what time frame are we working at? And we said, I don't know, 15 years. And I can tell you why that's a good number. Because let's imagine that the rest of you, that WaterFix moves forward. WaterFix isn't going to be done for at least 15 years. And if the federal government gets involved, who knows? But no, I'm being disingenuous on purpose. So what are you going to do the next 15 years? Because WaterFix won't be online by that time. And what of the major infrastructure projects would be online in the next 15 years? And I can't think of any, at least in the Sac Valley, big projects. So it ended up that was a satisfactory number for us. I realize that was the wrong way to do it, but.
Carl?
No, I'm just
You're just working on the button so you're ready when the time comes. Okay.
My button's ready.
Skip.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jeff, give you a quick history lesson about Solano County. I have my Solano County Supervisor hat on now. Starting in 1986, the voters of Solano County passed an initiative that said we're going to protect our agricultural land. We're going to require all development to be in the city limits. Annex developed in the city. We've had 2 general plan updates as a result of those initiatives. You know, when you talk about a restored delta, you're talking about 30,000 acres in Solano County. Mm-hmm. And this is that area that we in Solano County feel very protective of. It's going to decimate the agricultural economy, if you will, a small town of Rio Vista, town of Dixon. What do you say to the Solano County residents and those of us that represent the citizens that, you know, we need to do this because it's the right thing to do?
Yeah. So I work for PPIC, so we're deeply familiar with farm issues and farm economies and the management of farm economies. So I'm not coming at it from a complete ignorance in that regard. We recognize that there are significant social, economic, and environmental trade-offs that have to be done. And to date, we don't have that. I mean, we typically take the willing seller kind of approach, and that's why EcoRestore has to take advantage of targets of opportunity. What we have not done is to find a way to make sure that people are made whole. People, cities, local economies are made whole as we do these actions which have broad societal benefit, broad social and economic benefit, and obviously there are environmental benefits. We haven't figured that out yet. We have lots of ideas for how to do it, but at a point, this is one of the most important, difficult discussions that has to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, nothing will happen. And if nothing happens, we know this, I mean, I'll be dead, right, in another 20 years, I don't know, hopefully not, I don't know, somewhere in there, I mean, the next 20 years, we'll be having the same conversation. So this is where leadership has got to come from the state and the counties to say, look, I mean, I live in Yolo County, right? And I've watched Yolo County evolve in its thinking and its approaches, and particularly on the Yolo bypass, and people of goodwill negotiating these things and saying, look, you know, we recognize that we have to get together and negotiate these things, that there is no perfect solution to it. I offer the science. The science is not the answer here. It's going to be a social science question for the people who live there. And we haven't figured that out yet, so I don't have an answer for you.
And Jeff, to the YOLO project, that was a cooperative agreement between ag and the water interests, if you will,
Correct.
and the fishes.
Correct.
And they were able to adjust farming to accommodate that.
Yep.
We're talking about wholesale conversion of ag land to ecosystems. And and I might do a kind of a stand on my soapbox comment that, to add insult to injury, when the state takes land from the counties, takes it off their tax roll, they're supposed to pay us through the PIL program. I think we're owed $1 million from the state. So, it's insult to injury. If they're going to take our land, then they ought to at least stand up to their requirement to pay the county for that loss.
Supervisor, you make a very good point, but I do remind you, I've lived in Yolo County since 1980, and it was hell no, not in our backyard. That's where the supervisors were when I was there, and as I think like Dan and others began to sort of work on the concept of the Yolo bypass, it evolved into, all right, actually we can collaborate and cooperate on this. That is the solution. Negotiated solutions are the only solution. Doing it as a top-down is highly unlikely to work. Okay.
So we're moving on to the next aspect of this topic, and that is how do we build support for DPIIC agencies to work beyond what's required, what type of resources are needed. Skip, your most recent question causes me to look ahead, and you targeted the 30,000 acres in Solano County. Jeff didn't respond very well to that, I didn't think, because there is potentially an opportunity to provide incentives for landowners who know the land better than anyone else in that 30,000 acres to shift their farming practices to become more ecosystem friendly. And I think that's the kind of approach that we need to begin generating as we look forward, because we all have fears, but and most of them are economic when it comes to the county level. Trust me, I live in Merced County, one of the poorest counties in the state. But if there is a way to incentivize farmers to change practices that yield the benefits that we're all seeking around this table, then it's a win-win. So I hope that, those are the kinds of things that we can drive a conversation about today. Eileen?
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Randy, because, and Jeff, thank you for your group and your suggestions to the board. But the board's mechanism, it's kind of like turning an aircraft carrier. We'd love to be more nimble, but being nimble in an aircraft carrier means something different than in other contexts. And I actually really appreciate the fact that that you guys framed your blogs in terms of the voluntary settlement agreements, because I think that the board is trying very hard to be open to voluntary strategies that stakeholders come up with independent of the board and bring to the board to say we can do what you can do better. Through some of the ways that you've mentioned, Randy, and you, Mr. Thompson. And so, recognizing that if every time somebody came up with a brilliant new idea, we reset the board's planning process, we would be in perpetual planning mode, which it seems like we are sometimes. We want to get beyond that, but we want to be able to, in some meaningful way, incorporate the kinds of great suggestions that you guys have come up with. And I think that at this point, it may well be that the voluntary settlement process is the best way to do that.
So moving forward, what do your agencies need to achieve a healthier habitat? Well, welcome, Secretary Ross.
Because I just is this on? Oh, that's the first test. So I apologize for being late. I was getting a very good briefing on groundwater recharge. So I have more of a question. I'm also speaking as the one agency at this table that has no statutory authority to do this, but lots of enthusiasm and belief in what's possible. And I think that one of the things that's missing as we try to shift, let's prioritize these short-term things, is that everything does take time for people to have confidence, to build the trust, to say this is the right path to go. And so I guess one of my questions is, we can create incentive programs, but where is the check-in point to measure and say it's on the right pathway so that we can build that level of confidence and trust for everyone to say, this is working and we are getting there and we're on the right pathway. I think that's a huge missing piece of this. And so I appreciate your comments, like by concentrating in the North Delta arc, there's more there to work with, and we collect the data and we have results, which doesn't keep us from working in the San Joaquin, but I think it's very important and informative for us to be able to have those kinds of check-in points and ways of measuring to build the trust so that we can negotiate where it's going to be more challenging. And I'd just love to know your thoughts about what is the best way of monitoring and
It's
measuring.
back to the water quality control plan, which sets a series of milestones and benchmarks. I mean, and I think that's probably your best bet, including a carrot and stick kind of approach. We've talked about this in the past, where there's off-ramps. Proposals we made last fall for an ecosystem water budget, management of an ecosystem water budget, and one of the suggestions we had is to set an ecosystem water budget and a series of objectives that the multiple parties would agree to and work together, and if they don't, there's an off-ramp here. I mean, I can give you an explicit example as the board's going forward with their water quality control plan. They really have a choice. They could make an outflow-based approach, which is really focused on volumes of outflow. They can make a physical habitat-based approach where they're just monkeying with the land and not worrying about the water, or they can do what we suggested, which is the third alternative. But if people don't uphold their part of the bargain, one of the off-ramps might be high outflow. And that's a great incentive for getting people to check in and be involved and stay engaged all along rather than walking away. In any case, that was one of our suggestions to you. But mostly you've got to have a carrot and stick to make it work.
Barry?
Just in terms of sort of relates to what you were just mentioning about, so we have spent a lot of time from a sort of science and monitoring perspective identifying what's wrong or what the problems are. But I do think we could do a better job of having information out there about what the benefits are, what do you gain from specific projects, and not just the benefits to the species that we're interested in, but the benefits to the land users, irrigation, ag, others, and benefits to the ecosystem. And I think that's where trying to do a better job on some of those indicators so that you can actually achieve longer-term buy-in on these projects, because we talk about ecosystem type components. A lot of times, I think people are just talking about sort of multi-benefit type components or projects in the system, and we sort of use those interchangeably sometime. And I do think by focusing on those multi-benefit things, you're gonna lift a lot of the species, a lot of the indicators in the system overall, and I think it's a great approach.
A former lead scientist for CalFed said, science in the Delta is crime scene investigation. And that was back at his time. And it's changed a lot from that. Now we're no longer doing crime scene investigations. Oh, we do a fair amount of crime scene investigation. We're starting, particularly in the pod, when we did the pelagic organism decline work, we started to transition to trying to describe to people what the benefits would be. So one of our recommendations is a very strong science program. If you don't have that, you can't create those reassurances. And that's why we said you need to elevate it, to have a science program which takes on that charge, and we recommended the Delta Science Program. But that's for the next group to talk about.
Jeff, along these lines, the Stewardship Council is required to establish performance measures for the Delta Plan. Your concept of moving away from single species, single stressor to more landscape level approach suggests that we need to figure out a way to measure ecosystem functions.
Yes.
Is that possible?
Yes. I mean, they do it in other systems, so I don't know why we can't do it here. They do it in terrestrial systems, they do it in ocean systems. I don't see why they can't do it here. And it's done in estuary, Chesapeake, for example. They do. They look at functions. You've got Denise Reed in the room here, and she can tell you how they do it down in the Gulf. It's a matter of us deciding what are the desirable functions we have. This again comes back to a robust science program, and then basically determining those measures. I mean, we had a short series of conversations, and we went off the rails immediately into the details because there was a bunch of pointy-headed scientists and one economist was in there, and one engineer was in the room. But this, I think, this is not a hurdle. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think this is difficult.
Anyone else have, Carl, your microphone's on.
No, it's not.
Now it's on. So, I just want to provide one caution here. And having done this for 30 years now in San Francisco Bay and now in the Delta, is that we all want to do things as fast as possible. But part of doing these things, particularly as it relates to science or performance measures or other things that are done in a collaborative forum, just take time. And there needs to be a recognition. The only way you can help facilitate that, because many of the efforts that I've been involved in have been ad hoc, and you basically get people doing it in addition to what they're supposed to be doing, is provide some resources to support those kinds of activities. We have an issue around the Delta Conservation Framework. Okay, we'll have a conservation framework. Who's going to help advance it? Whose conservation framework is it? We have another, effort in the Central Delta Corridors Partnership that's looking at the Central Delta and what could be done there into the future. It's all on public land. It does affect surrounding private lands as well as farmers who farm on the public lands. But how do you work through that system? And it takes a lot of time and energy. The same thing goes if you want to talk about restoring Frank's Tract to something different than what it is and changing how the system works. So I think that's just the cautionary point, is that it takes time and resources to be able to do those kinds of things from the agency perspective, from the citizen perspective, from the NGO perspective, and the local government perspective. And we can't not disregard that if we want things to happen in a timely manner.
So let me turn it around to you, Carl. I'm the one who gets to ask a question. Do you think we are organized well to do that?
I think a lot of it comes back to the capacities of the organizations that are at this table. And they're not constructed to necessarily do this kind of work. They're constructed to be regulators, or to some degree conservation planners, or planners of projects, specific projects and activities, and not in broad-based engagement. And that's where the problems arise, is being able to have that regulator go into a room with their hat on in the perspective that I'm trying to solve a problem here that's within the bounds of what I'm regulating. And I know you can't be pre-decisional and all that kind of stuff, but you can think creatively about how you manage the system, not for a particular species, but if the system is healthy, the species will be doing much better. And that was the whole underpinning of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan. And it set us on a track. Unfortunately, there wasn't a willingness to accept the cost of that. So we've stepped back, and it gets really big and complicated. But I think that is where the ability and the resources to think about things from a big perspective is what is needed, and to engage at multiple levels to make sure that there's buy-off on what you end up with in the end.
do you have a follow-up question?
No,
to that?
it was great. The answer was no. In my view, we're not really well organized to do that kind of thing, and that's what you're here for.
So now the question to the committee is, how do we get there? I think we would all agree we would want to get to the place that Carl described. How do we get there? What's the venue? What's the forum? What's the guidance? What does it take to move cautiously, but I recall at our very first meeting, Will Stell looked around the room towards the end of the meeting and he said, around this table exists the authority to achieve nearly all of the goals that have been set forth before us, but we have to exercise flexibility to the greatest degree that we have available to us. We have that flexibility. We need to exercise it. And it's sort of been the common theme of these meetings from that first time was, how do we find these areas where we can further the cooperation? I think, Carl, you provided a good overview of the challenges that we all face trying to achieve an improved ecosystem in the Delta, to try and improve water supply reliability for the state. So before we leave this topic, what kind of resources do you all need to improve each of your agencies' progress towards achieving the coequal goals? And I'll start with you, Carl. What do you need?
Well, I'm going to speak for myself as a short-timer, but from my perspective, for the department to be effective at this, we need, 5 or 6 positions that work on these kinds of issues and aren't bound by a specific charge, other than to work on solving these issues, facilitating the permitting, both participating in the planning and getting projects to the point where they can be permitted, and setting them up, designing them in a way that facilitates that permit at all levels, whether it's our permitting, whether it's any other agency's permitting process. And I would expect that most of my colleagues would probably agree with me that that's the only way you do it effectively. None of our regulatory agencies have people who focus on, certainly without significant limitation, who just focus on conservation planning and achieving restoration objectives. There's money out there, there are some people that do it, but they're generally pretty focused in what they're doing as opposed to thinking in a bigger picture.
It's good. Others? Tim?
I'll just speak for our experience. I think we've demonstrated in the last few years, and I'm sure Bill's spoken to this, that like a lot of the agencies, we don't have the resources to keep up just day-to-day operations and maintenance. We struggle. That said, I think we're also viewed almost always still as only regulatory. Despite the fact we adopted the plan, we have no responsibility to implement it, and no people to implement it, or people to write it, for that matter. DWR did a really great job because they wrote the plan. One of the things we did, though, that I think really was important the second time around in 2017, and we did this right after 2012, because we knew we wanted it to be more bottom-up, is we worked with the department to establish 6 different regional forums in the Valley and asked them what they thought needed to be part of the plan in 5 years. And that ended up being the 2017 plan, by and large, the pieces of it. But what we need are those forums to continue. Now that the plan's been adopted, people are taking ownership of the actions in it and implementing some of them, and Chris has done a big part of that in the North Delta. But in other parts of the Valley, it's mostly reclamation districts and JPAs that are doing the work. And they're getting state and federal resources, but they do a really great job. They're nimble, more nimble than we are. They have resources, they have a revenue stream, and they know it's hard. Most of them, we had a tour just last year. In fact, it was the same trip and the same day that Sustainable Conservation came and visited the board and talked about their permitting. This was just, I think, earlier in the year with Reclamation District 108, one of the first in the state. And as part of that day, they shared the history of their organization. And nobody liked what they were doing when they started 150 years ago. people hated it. The neighbors hated it, the landowners hated it, they didn't want to pay for it, they thought it was crazy, they thought it was inefficient, and they stuck to it. And every year, I think they become a little bit different and a little more flexible and a little more nimble, but they're the ones on the ground. They take responsibility for day-to-day operation, they take responsibility for now some of the long-term planning, and they do a really great job, and there's others like them. So from our standpoint, for the Valley, we need more forums and more people like that to take ownership and responsibility, because if we can knit them together with a vision at the state level, or in this case the Valley level, then they have something to aim for. But they're also better resourced and better equipped, I think, to make it happen.
Maybe I'll just add a little bit. I was commenting before that the Army Corps of Engineers is a project-based organization. It also is worth mentioning that we don't do much ourselves. We work with partners. We have non-federal sponsors, so-called. So this doesn't totally answer the question that you were asking, but I just wanted to reinforce that that we work with others on projects and we work with others on studies. We can do watershed planning as well, and we've done some of that if we have an interested cost share sponsor, so that can get at partly, the visioning that you're talking about.
Dave?
Well, I think that, one of the tools that is working well for reclamation is working with the Delta Science Program and trying out some of these collaborative techniques for getting together, looking across different values and different benefits, and actually trying to put some institutional learning practices in place. We're working on structured decision-making right now. It seems to be going pretty smoothly. We're not at the end yet, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that pans out and where we find it's useful and where we might learn of other things we can do to coordinate some of these resources better and come together for some of the trade-offs, and maybe it will even help us with the focusing.
Barry?
Hey, Randy, I was just going to, I think, Carl is right from the perspective in the regulatory agencies that, in our agency, we basically have the same people doing the regulatory side, and if they have some free time, working on the ecosystem and the restoration side of it. And this tends to be the stuff they want to work on. That's why they became biologists and trying to move forward. But there's always this tension on the regulatory side. And so we've done a lot of work to try to minimize the regulatory piece in terms of efficiency and, and the programmatic biological opinions with the Corps and others to try to sort of lessen those projects that really have a small impact on the species so that you can actually free up that time. The other piece I'd put out there is a really, and focusing on the ecosystem piece is project design. And if you can actually design projects that have a benefit, that have a clear benefit to the species overall, it makes it easier on us to get through the process, and it makes it easier on everybody to move those through. That we tend to manage a lot of projects that come in the door are sort of managing to that fine line of whether those impacts to a species or not are allowable or not. And so there's a lot of discussion about, is it just enough or not? And if you have a clear benefit that's benefiting the ecosystem and the species, you don't have to have that long drawn out discussion. You can actually move forward on a project and keep things moving in the system. And so just sort of throw that out there. It really is sort of that balancing of time, but it does help when you have a broader benefit to the overall programs.
All right. Well, thank you for the discussion, for the suggestions. We've got some work to do, particularly at the Stewardship Council as we, Deborah, did you have a comment? Okay, please.
Being with the Conservancy, we're in a unique position of not having a regulatory role, which is actually really nice. And if we could get to the point where we had a unified ecological vision, which I would hope that any priorities that get set don't exclude or negate the projects of opportunity that we do have, like Carl mentioned, in the Central Delta Corridor, where we have kind of all those pieces are falling into place. But if we could get that, then I think having some additional resources, as everybody would like to have, for us to be able to go out into the community and build those relationships. The Conservancy is uniquely situated to be to be able to bring those interests together and be a liaison. But again, it takes resources to do that. And I think we need to be really mindful of change management. We have these opportunities to sit here and do this brainstorming and have this thinking, but the Delta community, that's harder for for them. And so when we finally say, yes, we've got it, let's move forward, they go, oh, holy cow. And it can be tough for them. So just being really mindful of change management and how we bring these things forward through the framework or other processes, to just be careful of that.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for that. That's, you all did your homework well and brought back a lot of good suggestions. I think at this point, we'll take a cell phone break. It's 5 after 3. We'll reconvene in about 10 minutes. Oh, and by the way, before you go, there is a phenomena. It's called the Delta Stewardship Council meeting phenomena. It seems like every time we meet, it rains. It rains. In February, the only day it rained in February was the day the Delta Stewardship Council met. So welcome to the Delta Stewardship Council phenomena.
Okay, yeah. Nice to see you. Yeah.
In an agreement we had with you was to work on
Okay,
these kinds of activities.
we are going to reconvene.
Huh?
And
You're not supposed to.
I'm reminded that the goal of these meetings is to drive some conversation that leads to some good outcomes. And sometimes when we conclude an agenda item, there are further thoughts that occur. And I want to embrace that. And it seems that Chris Churnell needed a break to process his thoughts further. You have something more to add on the agenda item number 3, the future Delta.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I promise to be quick so that we can move on to the next agenda item. But, you know, one thing that strikes me in relation to the question of, so what can we all do, or what can I do, or what anybody can do to help, you know, create some breakthroughs with progress and restoration. And a lot of it is, you know, are our staffs, and I wish the supervisor was back, you know, but including folks at Resources Agency and our departments, you know, under our umbrella, at the federal level too, are staff who are engaged in these necessary conversations empowered to ask simple questions. Like, okay, so Solano County, if the state is not going to because we aren't statutorily required to, and because there would be other implications to this, necessarily agree to ag mitigation in every case? Are there other proxies for ag sustainability? Are there other definitions of that? Are there other components of this larger objective, which isn't necessarily always an acre-for-acre protection of land, that might be involved in a habitat restoration project, like a tidal habitat restoration project? Is there another language that we can find common ground around that we can actually wheel and deal with? For example, we're doing a lot of work in the Yolo bypass right now, and a lot of the reasons why we're successful, as some of you have kind of heard reference to today, is because even though we, the state, won't agree to a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 or even a 1-to-1, ag mitigation ratio that's being oftentimes requested of us from local jurisdictions, because that's a huge deal to local jurisdictions and to others, of course, and that makes sense. But what we can do is help with reclamation district consolidation. What we can do is help with installing new irrigation infrastructure, new drainage infrastructure. We can bring concerned agricultural interests into the regulatory framework so that their activities are now covered where before they weren't. And so there's a greater level of sort of security, if you will, around the ongoing sustainability of an agricultural operation. Those are the types of things we can do, and that's where a lot of the breakthrough is happening. And it really just takes us being able to feel confident in ourselves to say, and in our jobs, frankly, and say, okay, so Skip, supervisor, what do you need? I may not be able to provide all these things, but is it really just acreage, or does ag sustainability to you mean something beyond that? That's a metric that makes sense, but it's also a limited metric. There are bigger pieces that define sustainability, and of course, agricultural issues are only one flavor of the issue I'm raising, but it's really this empowerment of let's all agree to a more interesting, creative conversation than maybe we've been used to in the past. I think that's a lot of potential in there for breakthrough.
Chris, thanks. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll help provide a venue for that specific discussion. Beginning in June, our planning staff is going to be bringing back suggested amendments to the ecosystem chapter of the Delta Plan, and that's where this conversation should occur. So, and Skip, you missed a really good presentation, so you'll have to review it on the webcast tomorrow when these guys put it up. But we will continue this conversation at a Delta Stewardship Council meeting or subsequent meetings, talking about what local agencies need to conform with the state ecosystem restoration objectives in the Delta. So Chris has offered up some good suggestions. So our planning staff is here, they're taking notes, and I'm sure that we'll have a good, robust conversation about that. So thank you for that added point. All right, with that then, before I introduce the next agenda item, remember at our November meeting, we heard from the Delta Science Program staff on the completed Science Action Agenda. This guiding document was a product of collaboration among most of the agencies around this table. At our last meeting, the Science Action Agenda was released, and we received a commitment from you all to contribute and continue working on these actions. We did not, however, and it was my bad, ask to receive a formal endorsement for the Science Action Agenda. So at this time, I would like to ask the committee to endorse the Science Action Agenda that you all received at our last meeting. Is there any objection? Hearing none, we will endorse the Science Action Agenda through common consent. How's that? All right? And I think now that we've been so successful in getting that done, Dr. Callaway, I think you have one more suggestion.
I have one other thing that's not on the agenda that we've talked with some of you about. So as you all know, the science plan is being updated this year as part of the 5-year review of the science plan. And actually, we've made lots of progress. We've had a public meeting recently with very good turnout from many of your staff and a lot of good input that we're now working on and incorporating into a public draft that will come out in the next probably about 8 weeks or so, sometime in the summer. And one idea that our staff came up with that I think is a great idea and that I want you to think about is the preamble to the current plan was written by the former lead scientists, endorsing the important role of science, which I think was really valuable. But what was suggested was that the DPIIC could write and endorse the preamble for the new science plan to show not just scientists feel that science is important, but that the directors feel that science and the use of science for management decisions are important. So we don't need to decide on it today, but I wanted to float that idea to you and see if there's any thoughts or questions about that. And then what we would probably do is have our staff work with probably the Delta Agency Science Work Group to draft the preamble, get it to you way before the November meeting, and then consider it at the November meeting. Any questions or any thoughts?
So expect to hear from us prior to the November meeting. Now, we're on to our final agenda item, 1 Delta 1 Science. Governance, for better or worse, has a long history in the Delta. Long before CalFed unto now, we've been discussing how to manage policy decisions, science, and their intersection for years. Today, despite many successes, the pursuit of an effective science policy interface continues. In recognition of these continuing challenges, the Delta Science Program is planning to include a section on governance in the updated Delta Science Plan. Dr. John Callaway today will guide this agenda item and provide us with a bit more background on the Delta Science Plan update, the need to discuss governance, and to introduce our panel. So at this time, I'm going to kick back and turn the meeting over to Dr. John Callaway.
Okay. Thank you, Chair Fiorini. So as was mentioned, for the science plan update, the issue of governance is really something that's very critical that really isn't currently addressed in any detail in the current science plan. And actually, it was at the previous meeting in November that Paul Souza brought up the question of how do we use the data that's collected and incorporate it into decision making? What's the structure, what's the governance that's there for science to provide valuable science that addresses the challenging management needs that we have? And so we definitely plan to incorporate some of those issues into the updated science plan. And we've already been getting lots of input from a number of people on governance issues, but we thought it would be very useful to have a discussion here, similar to what we just had around ecosystem issues. And so we put together an outstanding panel of experts on the topic. Bruce DiGennaro, who's the facilitator for the CSAMPT effort. Tracy Collier, who's a member of the Delta Independent Science Board and has worked with the Puget Sound Initiative. I think I got that name right, I hope. And Mark Lubell, who's a professor at UC Davis, whose area of expertise and research is directly focused on science governance issues and incorporating science into challenging management decisions. And actually, his report is included in your binder on governance issues around sea level rise in San Francisco Bay. So again, we have 2 questions that we will think about for this topic, and the panelists will get the first crack at the questions, and then you'll have a chance to think about those questions and ask the panelists questions that you have. So the first question is, how have you seen science governance evolve in the Delta, and are we moving in the right direction? And the other general thing that the panelists might want to think about is, what are some of the critical issues or critical things that we need in order to have good governance and effective governance within the Delta? So Bruce, maybe if you want to start off. Yeah.
There we go. How's that? That better? Okay, thank you. So thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and see you all. And this format's a little weird for me. I'm not used to having the audience at my back, but that's okay. I realize you're the audience too, but the rest of the audience, I like to look at everybody as a part of the discussion, right? So I'll answer the 2 questions, and then I'll try to put something out there to make you all think about maybe where we go from there.
Actually, Bruce, so you can just start with the first. So we'll focus on the first, okay, and okay, get some feedback, and then we'll get to the second.
All right, fair enough. So yes, I think we definitely have evolved. I think Carl said it well. We are doing well, and I think it's important to kind of celebrate some of our successes and remind ourselves. So I think we know a lot more than we did before, say 10 or 20 years ago. I think we've invested in science considerably. Could we invest more in science to learn more? Yes. But I think there has been a lot of investment. I think there's been a lot of knowledge. I think the question is then what do you do with that knowledge, or how do you direct that knowledge? Jeff mentioned the world of combat science. I do think we've moved away from that. Part of what created CSAMP was a desire to move, to collaborate rather than litigate. I don't think, any of us think we're going to live in a world where there's no litigation, but I think we are trying to work together more to solve some of these kind of complicated problems and not litigate science. That seems like kind of a silly thing to try to do. So I think we have evolved. Specific things, I think we're doing much better. We're communicating better with one another. I think we're sharing data better, and some of that is, can be supported by technology. I think we're collaborating more. I think we're engaging stakeholders more. I mean, I think there's still work to be done there, but I think we're doing that better than we have historically. I think there's much greater transparency. I think DPIIC is a good example of that, having these meetings in public, sharing this kind of information. And I also think that one of the things that really came out of CalFed in the CalFed days is a much stronger role for independent science. And I think we're doing that much better, and I think that's a vast improvement as well. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I forgot to mention before you go, Tracy, there are many acronyms. There's many organizations, collaborative organizations. Besides the many agencies, there's many collaborative organizations within the Delta. And we made a little cheat sheet for you that has, because I think most of us know what CSAMT and CAMT and all these different organizations are, but if you don't, there's a cheat sheet that's with your binder that has the acronyms, the organizations, some brief descriptions of their roles and the participants. And then as well as that, I think Mark put together a little network diagram just over the weekend of the connections amongst all of these organizations. These are the kinds of things that we'd like to develop in much more detail to help show and provide some clarity on the roles of all these organizations. So, Tracy.
Wow. Wake up. So, yeah, my involvement with the Delta Science Enterprise really only goes back to 2010 when I first came onto the Delta Independent Science Board. My involvement has been with the Puget Sound region and the West Coast, Northwest Coast for many years. So I haven't seen as much of an evolution perhaps as you have, Bruce. I was aware of the CalFed. I would often come down here and help them review their proposals, and I always envied CalFed at how much funding they had and how much they were able to spend, and I know that became a source of some consternation in some circles. But I would agree largely with what Bruce said. I think there has been this evolution away from things being as contentious as they were. I remember at our first ISB meeting, Jeff Mount was on the board at that time, and I think that one of the first pronouncements he made was, "This is so contentious, you won't believe it if you're from outside the region. Somebody's not going to survive this process." I mean, he was very gloom and doom, shall we say. Anyway, so I think there has been that evolution. I think that we could be doing better. The things you talked about, the data sharing, the communication, those are all things that happen with a great deal of effort. But I do think that, and we'll talk about this in sort of the second question, are there other approaches we could take that would maybe support those aspects better? And also, I think an important thing is to increase the credibility of the science so that the people that are having to make decisions, the people in this meeting having to make decisions based on the science, need to know that we've got your back as far as the science being credible and objective. And again, we'll talk about that as we go on, I think.
Good afternoon. Thanks so much for allowing a social scientist into your midst. Well appreciated. So I would like to definitely echo the fact that there's been a huge advancement in our knowledge of the Delta over the years. And can we imagine where we would be without, for example, CalFed, right? Often the things that we forget are the counterfactual, like where would we be without all the investment in the programs that we have had, and all that knowledge has been put to use in a lot of different decision makings. But as that goes forward, we've had a major increase in the complexity of the science ecosystem. And if you put that network diagram back up, the folks over there. So that is at least a partial picture of the messy system of just the Delta science ecosystem. And I would like to make sure to acknowledge that my former student, PhD student, Mateo Robbins, is the one who actually put that network diagram together. So the only thing I can take credit for there is putting him in front of the right programs to learn how to do that. So he's back there in the audience. So if you want that sort of work, he's available for hire sometime soon. And yeah, that's true for now. Hopefully for a long time. So you see in the center of that network is interesting that you see a lot of the typical characters you might expect, the state and federal agencies who are sponsoring that program. But Mateo has not done this work yet, but if you did the vintage of those different processes, those yellow circles on there, I'm guessing a lot of those were created in the last 5-10 years. So there's been a bit of an explosion of different science programs. So it's become messy. But that mess is not necessarily a bad thing. That mess is indicative of a fairly healthy system in which a lot of investment is happening. It's indicative of a fairly democratic system in which there's a lot of opportunities for people to self-organize and join. But then the question becomes, how do you effectively manage that mess, and how do you effectively navigate that mess as an individual researcher, agency, interest group, whatever it might be? Those are questions that need to be answered, and I think are important questions to focus on in the Delta Science Plan itself. Phil Eisenberg, I'm sure many of you know, in a response to one of our papers, described these systems as systems where everyone's involved but no one's in charge. And that, I think, is a good description of the system, and we have to understand how to manage that.
Okay, anything else, Bruce or Tracy, anyone that you want to add before we? Okay, so questions, either questions for the panelists or response to that question from any of the DPIIC members? Tim, were you going to?
I was waiting for Randy, but I'm having a lot of very fond memories. And I don't know that everybody knows the history of my background, which is not very long in the grand scheme of things, not as long as Carl's. But I do remember when the science program was established in the Alpha Beta Delta program, and hiring the first lead scientist and creating the first program plan with the agencies. And I just wanted to echo a couple things that Bruce said. The independent nature of what exists now is, I think, really refreshing and always been super valuable. There's always insight to be gleaned from other places and other people that have different experiences, and I think bringing that into a forum like this will always be extremely useful and valuable, and it always has been. It's great to have a person sitting at the table, I think, as well, which makes a big difference for the transparency. The one thing I think that has always been more of a struggle has been trying to strike a balance with the resources and also the agencies that are responsible for some of the regulatory components in the system. But I've not been part of that discussion recently. I just know that it's evolved. There's new acronyms on this sheet for me. Thank you for explaining some of those. I didn't know all of them. But it sounds like it is, I wouldn't call it new, but I think it's headed in the direction it has been, which I think is very encouraging. I think it brings a lot of value to the table always. And I think there's always more to be done. But I really appreciate the work that folks have been doing, the folks that are here, that are still here, that have been part of it from the get-go, and also the people that have brought their experience from other places. I think it's really important.
So how have you seen Delta governance, science governance evolve? That's the question. Mark?
Yeah, so Randy, I don't have the long-term perspective. I've only been 5 years kind of in my chair. But I think even over that time, I've seen things improve. I don't know if I would say there is a Delta science governance so much as interweaving governances from the different groups, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've seen improvements in how they leverage resources, avoiding redundancies too. I've seen that. That's been rewarding. But echoing something said earlier, it's still a real challenge to put resources to the, what do you call, the next level questions beyond the immediate. So I think that's an area that could still use some improvement. Yeah.
Others? Dan?
So it was interesting you restated the question, because most of what we've talked about so far isn't really governance, it's how we practice science. And for me, independence, the independence of the science we use and the processes, the Delta Science program was huge. But I don't think we've quite gotten to governing that science, and I'm not even sure what that means. So maybe I didn't read the question as closely as I should have before I got here, but what do we mean by governing science, and what would a vision for that be? It runs counter to independence.
Yeah. Dan, I promised I wouldn't alter the questions, that I would stick to the printed material. And so you've posed a question back, and I'm going to hand it off to the lead scientist.
I'll hand it off to Mark Lubell, who's the expert on governance, so to let Mark, I think if anyone here could talk about that.
Okay, sure. I mean, so I think there's governance writ large is a term for me where you have groups of actors who are collectively getting together to make decisions, and writ large is you're talking things like, should we have the Delta Stewardship Council or not, or should we have a Central Valley Flood Plan or not, or should we have CV salts, and how does the federal and state legislation all work together? I think a lot of people commonly think of governance like that, but when you think about science governance, it's how do you create institutional structures that enable science to be developed in a way that is most useful to decision making, and that includes creating governance structures for science that helps maintain that independence, right? That doesn't come from just a vacuum, that independent science. It actually is a product of things, for example, like the creation of the Independent Science Board and the way that it's, how it's appointed, how it delivers information to the decision maker. So for me, that's always the question: how do you design those institutions? And when we have this network here, interweaving governance is a good way to think of it. Is there is institutional structures in there, but can we think about them as a system? And what sorts of institutional changes would be needed to achieve the goals of the science enterprise that you want to get? And I think that more explicit thought needs to be put into that, and I think that's where the chapter, for example, in the Delta Science Plan should go, because there's not anybody that I think really has a really strong answer for that yet, because we haven't been studying it for very long from that perspective.
Dan, is that helpful?
Yes, that's helpful. So in that context, where we've made big advances is that we have groups that provide recommendations that are independent of the decision makers. We have groups that collaborate and talk about the kinds of decisions we think we ought to support. And then we have, I think, mostly individual bodies that then move forward with those decisions if they align with their priorities and capabilities. So there isn't a group deciding what science gets funded so much as a group that's recommending things get funded, and then other groups figure out how to get that done. And maybe I didn't capture that properly, but it's sort of the structure we have now, and on the recommendation side, the strength from my perspective we've been building is independence. And from the, deciding what kinds of science get done, the strength we've been building is broad collaboration. Those are the two areas that have changed the most since I've been involved. The thing we seem to still struggle with is now that we've decided what we're going to do, how are we going to get it done? How are we going to fund it? And who's going to take charge of making sure it happens?
Well, I'm glad you brought up funding because John and I suspected that
that's definitely
this would come up. In some of the research we've done, we've determined that about 80% of the money funding Delta Science goes to regulatory requirements, and there isn't a great deal of money going into the nearer-term decision support science. So I'd like to pose the question to our three panelists. This is an evolution of the science program that much of the work is funded because of regulatory requirements. How do we move beyond that to adopt a structure that provides consistent, ongoing funding for projects designed to support decision-making that may require more than a one-time, one-year funding stream?
Go to it.
So I'll start a little bit with experience from Puget Sound, where I grew up. So when we formed the Puget Sound Partnership, one of the first questions that people were concerned about regionally was, we have a long-standing monitoring program that's done by the states and feds and some NGOs, and it's pretty informal, but it's really effective. We've got really long-term data sets, and people were very concerned about losing that in this new structure that we were going to put down on top of everything else. Much the same has happened down here with IEP. Many people are concerned about maintaining both the continuity as well as the integrity of that effort. And so we had, for about a year, we had an ongoing formalized discussion among many agencies, many stakeholders, to say, and we basically made it a bimodal choice. We said, should we continue with the structure we've got, bring it under the Puget Sound Partnership, try to give it some more resources and try to keep it going, or should we, and this goes back to what Jeff was talking about earlier in the previous agenda item, would we look at something like a joint powers authority, look at something that we take all of this regulatory mandated monitoring, and we're focused mostly on monitoring and assessment for this question. Would we take that and take some of the funding stream from that and use that to support a more independent, if you will, but still very much with a lot of oversight from the different stakeholders and the contributors? Would we go that route? And so we talked about that for literally a year. I came down on the side, at the time I was still with NOAA Fisheries, so I didn't really have much of a dog in that fight. But I knew how effective the SFEI approaches had been. I knew how very effective SQUIRP had been and some other systems around the country. And so I came down on the side of the JPA type approach. Honestly, that was probably too difficult for people to make that jump at that time with the partnership just starting. So we went with the option B, which was maintain the current type of operations, bring them under the partnership, but don't give away any of their authorities, but have the partnership resource them, which is similar to what we're doing down here in the Delta right now, with the Delta Science Program providing a lot of support and resourcing of all these different collaborations and reviews, et cetera, what we're seeing. But we also said that when we did that, in 2 years, we are requiring a review, an external review of that decision to see whether or not we should revisit that decision. So by the time it came time for that review to be done, I'd left NOAA, and I was the science director for the Puget Sound Partnership, so it fell to me to commission the Ruckelshaus Center, started by Bill Ruckelshaus, to come in and do this external review of that decision and this current structure. The basic conclusions of that were, it's still working. It's working a little better than it was before. Nobody wants to make that big jump to go to this other structure. But we still have problems with transparency, problems with data management, problems with communications, and we just need to put more time and resources into it. My feeling is if we had made that bolder decision to go with a different structure, because we know, again, in my experience, these collaborative JPAs, or there's a number of ways that you can describe these, those tend to, if they have effective leadership, they tend to be very effective at driving parts of a science enterprise. So we are still in Puget Sound, we're still going along, muddling along. My personal view is we couldn't make that decision because the partnership was too new at the time. But now, for example, that the Delta Stewardship Council has been in effect for, close to a decade, or since the Reform Act, you have the opportunity to make that bolder decision and maybe make it work along the lines of what Jeff suggested. I'd be really interested to see how that discussion among you guys goes. That's all.
Bruce?
Yeah, so, Dan, you stole my thunder. It was exactly the question I was going to ask. It's this whole idea of science governance. What is science governance, right? So the more provocative question I was going to pose, which you've kind of already initiated, is should we be governing science? Is that really the question, right? It's, your question about, it's really the practice of science. And so I'd restate the question, Randy, as more, not should we govern science, but how do we want to engage the practice of science to support the management decisions, right? So it's a question of engagement. How do you get the information? Science is about generating information so you can make a better decision, right? So what I would say is don't try to govern it, you facilitate it, and you communicate it. Right? So I think those are the things. So in terms of thinking about mechanisms, I mean, funding is the best carrot you have, right? And I think if it's going to be collective, and so to get to your question, Randy, about how do we make it consistent and long-term, if there's and you asked a question to the group earlier on the previous discussion, what do you need? I think we have to ask the same question, what do we need in terms of information? What are we asking of the scientists? And if there's a collective need or a suite of collective needs, then there's this common force that's represented by all the different organizations that have a similar need, right? There's a mutual need. Now that generates funding, right, to then support whatever those decisions are. So I think there's other mechanisms. So I think essentially you need to empower the science, but you also, getting back to the communication, I think you have to have a dialogue with the scientists, because that's the other thing I think that we struggle with is this policy science interface is the communication and understanding each other so that the scientists understand what the managers need and the managers understand what the challenges and constraints are that the scientists have so that you can work together, right? So there has to be that communication. So I think that's key to empower it. I think you can get the funding for it. I think you need to try to incentivize it as much as you can so that there's a reason to do it, right? There's incentives built in. I guess the last two things I would promote while I have the floor is engaging the private sector, right? So this idea of a network, it's not just government, right? It's not just state and federal agencies, right? The private sector and all those different entities that are out there can be engaged, and we get some great power out of public-private partnerships. I mean, that's how we're doing Thule Red right now. We worked out an arrangement with DWR to work together, and we have this great public-private partnership. I mean, it's not really all science, that's a restoration, but anyway, I think that's key. I think the communication then, leads to the funding, leads to the learning.
Mark, did you have anything to add on funding?
Well, to some extent, I'm not quite sure what all the sources of the ISP funding is, or ISP funding, sorry, but I don't know. One of the governance challenges that we identified in the Bay Area is where does the political leadership come from? And when I'm talking about political leadership, I'm talking about like informal legislative caucuses and bills which might have something to do with money. And, getting more investment from the California State Legislature in a science program, I think, in the Bay Area is something people wanted, and I think is something that there it goes, could be a legislative target. But that's, I think, needs obviously further discussion and a better understanding of what the legislative basis is for the money that's coming to the Delta Stewardship Council for Science right now. whether that needs to be
and,
upped.
and to clarify, we're not talking about funding just for the science program, but funding for science in general within the Delta.
Right, like a science enterprise. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things about the JPA idea, which I think is interesting, but I don't think it's going to be a magic bullet in any fashion. If you look at this network again, the JPA idea as currently articulated appears to be fairly closely tied to the basin plan amendments and the flow standards, but there's a heck of a lot of science going on that's outside of that, that's linked to all kinds of other regulatory processes and decisions and planning and that sort of thing. And a JPA is unlikely to cover all of that, so I think that that needs to be recognized.
Thoughts from DPIIC members on any of those funding issues? Dave?
So I hear a lot about long-term stable funding, and I also think about from the money management side, the reality of annual appropriations. Are there models that you think have been effective that are maybe more part of the ebb and flow of budget processes?
From my perspective, yes, the SQUIRP, SFEI, what we were planning to do in Puget Sound, if you take, as Randy was saying, if 80% of the money that's going into the science enterprise is coming as a result of regulatory requirements, and a lot of that is in compliance, meeting different compliance requirements, we call it science because we're collecting data and analyzing it and reporting on it and using it to support some decisions, but it's not really that exploratory collaborative science. It's pretty focused on what the requirements are. And if you can then free up if people will be able to cede some of their authority to free up some of that funding, which is a large amount of money, to go into more of a collaborative effort where with stakeholders, including the communities, including the NGOs, you're setting your priorities for what, as Bruce was saying, what science questions should we be asking? What is it we need to know? You then have a lot more flexibility to be more responsive, in my view, to those sorts of needs. And again, I agree also with what Mark said. A JPA, you're not going to have one that's going to cover the entire science enterprise, but if you have high priority items like what Jeff Mount was talking about under the flow requirements, and if you really need credible, defensible, and quick science, you can think of ways to set up a JPA type approach to be more responsive to those questions and deal with that part of the science, but it's not going to cover everything, I agree.
So I think that over the last 10 years that I've been involved, I guess it's 12 now, with science in the Delta, we've come a long way. I think the key component has been the CSAMP process. Not that it addresses all topics, it doesn't, but it is pretty focused on developing collaborative science about the issues that are associated with water project operations and endangered species compliance, as well as water quality control compliance. And those are all kind of key areas. I think the one thing to keep in mind is that IEP is a monitoring program that was designed to address those kinds of issues. It is the science infrastructure that we have to do most of that kind of work. It's also the regulatory mechanisms through which we can do it. But it doesn't have an overarching science plan to guide the particular aspects of it. And I think that's where a lot of effort is underway through the CSAMP process to get to a science program that recognizes what we already do and anticipates what we need to do to answer questions about the health of the ecosystem in relationship. And just because it's the overarching one, what flow does in the system and how it modulates all the other stressors and or translates into whether or not species that we're interested in are doing better or worse. So I think that is a key thing to keep in mind that we have made a lot of progress on recently, and I expect that we'll continue to do that. And part of that is integrating what we do in CSAMP with the adaptive management process that's tied to the regulatory authorizations for the state and federal water projects and water fix, assuming it happens or doesn't. And, you know, probably ultimately what happens with the water quality control plan update and or the reconsultation and re-permitting of many things. And that relies on keeping going what we currently do, but also adapting it to address the questions, the specific management questions that we want to address as in those venues, and keeping in mind that it's focused on those venues.
So that's a good segue into we've talked a little bit about the second question, which is really how do we improve things into the future, but if the panelists, separate from the JPA, if there's other ideas or suggestions that you have that address those future improvements.
That doesn't have a button on it? There we go. Okay. So Dave, just two quick thoughts on models. I mean, I think there's a couple right here that, I mean, one pretty close to you is CVPIA, right? It's a longer term, I mean, it's an annual funding that's there. And granted, it's been focused on restoration more so maybe than science, and I think Prop 1 is another, new. I think the way that the Prop 1 solicitation lays out some key management questions and then allows for some creativity in the submittal of proposals to address those questions is a pretty good model, actually, I think. So I think those are two examples where, we are making some progress in terms of longer term funding. But I do think it needs to be maybe a little bit more directed, or this, a group like this has particular needs. As Carl said, we don't have, we can promote a more collective request, I guess, be a way to say that. So the only other thing I would add in terms of ways to go forward, a lot of people have asked me why is CSAMP quote unquote successful? And I think the jury's still out a little bit on how successful we are. We haven't been able to be as quick as we originally hoped we would be. But one of the reasons it's successful, I think, is because it's voluntary. It's a totally voluntary engagement. And it creates an interesting element because people are at the table because they want to be at the table and they think there's value. And if we don't continue to provide value, then the whole thing just dries up and blows away.
Any other thoughts, Tracy or Mark?
No.
Okay.
Not enough. One thing I want to point out in your agenda, it says at the very beginning, it says, Dr. Callaway will start the discussion with a working definition of governance.
Well, we let Mark, I wasn't going to try to define governance with someone here who's a pro. But as you framed it, is exactly how I would think of it. Both the structure that allows for us to produce science that's useful and usable, and the arrangement of organizations. And we do have this complex network that I don't think we're going to go away from, but the challenge is how do we continue to improve that? So any thoughts or questions from the DPIIC members on ways we might continue to make improvements?
Yes, Chris.
I can weigh in here. Usually I shy away from the science conversations, but I was really impressed with, Randy, how your staff put together the interim science action agenda and its various iterations, which was essentially, from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, but a really well-formulated gap analysis. And then that included implicitly a prioritization, and that then was used. It wasn't shelved, but it was put in front of the legislature, to your point, and used as a really strong example for why the Delta Stewardship Council should be empowered with several million more dollars than they had the previous year of general funds for science. And that's been successful for you for a couple years running now. So it's not the end all and be all. So a few $1 million, and hopefully we can all build on that. But it was a really thoughtful approach to what's needed. There's a lot out there. I think it started out with several hundred questions that were pressing within the scientific community of some sort, or in one way or another rather. that was too big of a number, so let's pare that down. What are the top dozen or whatever the number ended up being, and then let's make a strong argument for why it makes sense for the Stewardship Council to facilitate that work, and that was successful and maybe a model for, if not governance, big G governance, at least a thoughtful approach to a well-grounded mechanism to get stuff done.
Chris, if I could just add one more element to that. You're right, the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program staff did the heavy lifting. Lindsay and Yumi are in the back, and it was really their leadership, but it was also a collaborative effort. There was a representative from each of these agencies that met with them to help distill this down to ultimately what it became, which, by the way, we endorsed today. But it wasn't just one agency that did this. It was a collaboration of all of your input to agree on where the gaps lie. So hopefully that serves as a model for moving forward with the 5-year review and the update of the Delta Science Plan, that we can attract the same kind of help from all of you to do that, which is, I don't remember if I was supposed to ask for that or John was going to ask for that, but we'll get to that when everyone is finished talking about this particular item.
Other thoughts? So one thing I wanted to bring up that we talked about a tiny bit was the different kinds of science that's done. So there's all the compliance, that. Mostly what we've been talking about is sort of immediate, short-term response, adaptive management kind of data, responding to immediate concerns. What also is important that Mark brought up is the longer-term science, so that we aren't just looking at current things, but we have an eye on keeping things moving forward so that tomorrow's problems we're aware of and we're able to address them. Any thoughts on how we might be able to how we can be sure to do that effectively in addition to the short-term science? It's on. That light.
Oh, I'm on, okay. No red light, okay. So you're talking the longer range about the horizon scanning, which more and more people are doing, and how do we do this horizon scanning so that we anticipate things that haven't happened yet, that we haven't thought about? That's great. What I'm hearing in this conversation a little bit is it's all going pretty well. We've got good mechanisms. We're doing the right thing. But then when I am on the ISB and we're doing our reviews of the science, we're hearing a lot that the resources just aren't there for the agencies, for the Delta Science Program folks. That we need to be able to add on more tasks like horizon scanning. You're going to need more resources. And so I guess the question is, if it's going that well and it's a matter of more resources, then just focus on the resource question. If there is a risk of, if and when things get increasingly contentious around water in the Delta, if there is a need to have something that is seen as a little more autonomous or even more independent than the Delta Science Program is considered right now, think about that and think about how you would address that. Because if it happens to you in the moment of legal cases or whatever, as we found in the Columbia River, you will have a hard time pulling together the science advice that you need when the courts are breathing down your neck. So if it's going well, think about the resources and how to increase the resources. But if there are structural things that you, as a group, as a DPIIC, could be thinking about, how do you think about that and say, do we have the right structure right now or not? And that's a question, I think, for the community.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that, well, I'm a researcher, so I think there needs to be more research on the governance side and what the heck is going on before any really strong recommendations should be made. But I also think there is kind of two strategies you might think about taking. One is you reduce the complexity. There's a lot of complexity. The network's complex right now. Is doing something like a JPA going to reduce some of that complexity? Other consolidation, you know, I see like just in this list, there's like 3 adaptive management things, and there's data, there's monitoring. Is there some redundancies there that could be consolidated in various ways so that some of these science functions are more of a one-stop shop, or do each of those have their own niche within the ecosystem because of the time scale or the money or the issues that they address, so they're actually should be kept separate? That needs to be evaluated, I think, as one of the first things going forward. And so that's one strategy. It's messy now. Can we clean up this mess? I would say you don't want to make one scientist to rule them all, right? You need to have like that diversity is good, but exactly how much is a question needs to be answered. The other thing that I think should probably be done in the short term is embrace the complexity and help people navigate it. So I myself, and I've heard here on the panel, not everybody knows what all these acronyms are. Not everybody knows what all these programs are. So I think getting an understanding of what those are, developing some training for the staff and the agency leaders about what they are and how they function, their purpose, how they relate to each other, I think is a good first step, so that people know where to go to, where is the information they need, what's the value, what is valuable about the different processes. When the question about where is the best available science for the court cases or for the decision, can you point to the place where that best available science is? Because that is often the legal mandate that you actually have to adhere to for endangered species or CEQA or whatever it is. Do we know where it is for smelt? Do we know where it is for all of these different issues? I would say right now, if I did a survey of all of you and said, here on this thing, point to where the best available science is for climate adaptation, or the best available science for what, you would actually have quite diverse answers on that. And I think getting some more agreement on that was probably a very good first step. That doesn't require any structural change at the moment, but is more of a knowledge about what the ecosystem looks like.
So, John, we have more questions than answers.
Yes,
so there's obviously more work to do. I think maybe in summary, could you just summarize what you've heard and then provide an ask to the member agencies for some help?
Sure. So I think I heard that things are working reasonably well now, that definitely we've made lots of improvements. Those improvements have focused on independence, maintaining independence of the science programs, good, strong communication and collaboration across the various groups. There is lots of redundancy currently, but some of that's a good thing. I think definitely there's a need to provide some clarity, what Mark just mentioned, to all the roles that these different organizations provide and how to navigate the broad mix of organizations that are out there. I think the science plan, that's definitely one of the goals of this science plan, is to provide some clarity on that and to try to identify how the different organizations work together. And then I think the other important thing was around funding, that governance is intimately linked with funding issues, and we really need to think about how we can sustain more support for a science program. Not our science program as in the Delta Science Program, but the broad science program within the Delta. So those were the messages I heard. In terms of a request, we'd like to get more guidance from the DPIIC between now and the next meeting so that we can continue to develop the governance component of the science plan. And so we would like to ask you to continue to give some input either through the DASW or through a subcommittee of the DPIIC to the science program so that we get more guidance on how we can continue to fine-tune the governance component of the science plan.
So we're looking for you to designate someone from your agency to work with John and the science program to describe the governance portion of the Delta Science Plan. Are you all willing to contribute one of your staff or yourself to this project? All right. We have a history around this table of successfully addressing issues with representatives like this and Chris mentioned the Science Action Agenda is the most recent example of that. So I haven't seen any shaking of heads no. So I think you can contact the agencies and organize a meeting.
Great.
In closing, does anyone have anything else that they wish to share before we wrap up?
Oh, I want to thank the panelists
Very good.
for really leading us through that discussion. Super helpful. Thank you very, very much.
Bruce, Tracy, Mark, thank you. Thank you. All right. Just a reminder that there's a Bay Delta Science Conference that's going to be held here in Sacramento, September 10th to the 12th. That our next DPIIC meeting is going to be held on Monday, November 5th. And Amanda, no, I didn't forget. Is there anyone that wishes to make public comment before we conclude? Seeing none, then thank you all for coming. This meeting is adjourned.